The story begins with the Duchy of Winter, immersed in the cold, frosty atmosphere of the forest. The large palace, illuminated by the sun, proudly stood out among its rays. Silence reigned all around. A hand in a white glove squeezed the handle, splashing drops of blood, red marks flying around. The man in the top hat grinned. "Look at that," the other one said. "They said he was her favorite." Evelyn stood over the bloody man and said, "Impudent boy. He turned out to be a simple toy." The young man, wounded and weakened, was breathing heavily with his head down. Evelyn looked straight ahead, her gaze stern and unyielding. "Just try to say a word." The wounded and humiliated man squeezed out the words. "Putting this on. Naturally me." The man lay in front of Evelyn and finished his thought. "You said you loved me." Two women watched the scene. One exclaimed, "Oh my God, so that rumor was real?" Evelyn whispered contemptuously, "Love?" Then Evelyn laughed and asked sarcastically, "Do you seriously believe this? That naive, or just stupid? You completely forgot your place because I played with you." Evelyn's hand was clutching the whip. Drops of blood were running down it. Evelyn stood there with the bloody whip, her gaze cold. She said, "You're just disgusting." 10 years have passed since those events. The atmosphere in the duchy remains harsh and unapproachable. The sun's rays penetrated the decorated hall, illuminating the golden decorations and flower arrangements. The young maid smiled at the man as he pulled her towards him abruptly. She exclaimed. The man held the maid tightly despite her protests. "Quiet, everyone is busy. What if she finds out?" The man turned the maid to face him and said, "Turn around, again! Why are you doing this?" The man pressed himself tenderly against the maid, his words muffled. Hugging the maid, the man looked at the portrait of his mistress and muttered, "It's all because you're a villain, because your appearance has become so damn hot." The girl exclaimed, "You are a real pervert." The man's hand gently brushed the maid's hair, his touch soft and gentle. The man grinned, his eyes glittering with cunning. He said, "If you look at it that way, there is nothing special about this icy presence." The man looked up, his voice thoughtful. One day, that arrogant face would also distort. Suddenly, the door swung open, and a woman in black entered the hall, attracting attention with her appearance. The man and the half-naked maid looked at the woman who entered in confusion. It was Evelyn Winter who stood there, glaring at the pair. Evelyn was the head of the family. Just a few moments later, cries for mercy could be heard throughout the area around the once quiet castle. The man and the maid fell to the floor. "Please spare me, mistress. I have committed a mortal sin." Evelyn's voice was cold. "Take pity? After you admitted that it was a mortal sin?" Evelyn opened the box. "Well, I'll give you a choice since you ask for it. Slowly freeze to death." Evelyn pointed the gun at the man and added, "Or be killed with one shot. Which is better?" The maid begged Evelyn, "Please spare me, mistress. I won't do it again." The man trembled in front of Evelyn, his voice full of fear. "So please be merciful." Loud shouts came from the stairs. "Isaac, you know my situation, right? Please help me." Isaac suddenly hit the man, who cried out in pain. Then the man ran down the stairs, shouting, "Joseph!" Evelyn said coldly with a weapon in her hand, "Do you even care about my honor?" "How amazing!" Evelyn pointed the gun at the man. "Then for the glory of the Winters. Be a good man, just shut up and die." The maid clung to the man in fear. "Then, I promise that your coffin will be golden." Evelyn held the gun, her face impassive, and she said, "How about this? She will kill us. Evelyn Winter. Do you think your name will protect you forever? The era of the nobility is over." Someone shouted, "Go to hell!" Then Evelyn fired. Her eyes were blazing with anger. The bullet missed. And the man and the woman continued to run, disappearing into the distance, leaving behind only footprints in the snow. They moved away as quickly as they could to avoid losing their lives. Evelyn and Isaac stood on the balcony, looking out over the deserted gardens of the duchy. Silence surrounded them. "Let's say the error is too big. Tell them to focus on producing shells. It looks like your departure will be delayed because the sea is frozen." Evelyn asked, "Will it last a day or two?" Suddenly, without answering the question, Isaac shouted, "Lady!" Evelyn immediately turned around, after which the little girl in the red dress ran out of the door, and the maid ran after her screaming, "You can't go out." The girl's name was Sherry, and she was looking straight at Evelyn. And the maid said, "Mistress, forgive the noise." Evelyn crouched down in front of Sherry. Her voice softened, and she said, "It's okay, Sherry." The Duchess picked up Sherry and calmed the baby down. The wolf appeared and chased them away. "There's nothing to be afraid of here." Evelyn hugged Sherry and asked, "What did you draw this time?" Evelyn looked closely at Sherry, who was taking out a piece of paper with a drawing. Sherry showed a drawing of a flower, and Evelyn immediately muttered. "Flower?" Evelyn said. "I've never seen flowers like these here. Did you copy it from a book?" Evelyn then leaned over to Sherry, who was delighted with her drawing. Evelyn's gaze became attentive and thoughtful, and then she plunged into her memories. The tower stood against the backdrop of a green forest, symbolizing the tranquility and grandeur of the surrounding world. The guy held a blue rose in his hands and said, "Lady, this is for you." The guy approached Evelyn, who was sitting by the tree. What was this? He explained that he had it done in a studio. The man's voice was full of uncertainty. "If you don't like it, you can throw it away." Evelyn looked at the flower carefully, and the guy added, "I thought I should show it to you first." The girl looked first at the flower, then at the man in front of her, and said, "Beautiful." Evelyn held the rose, her face taking on a sad expression. What a pity it had no scent. The young man, watching Evelyn's reaction, was shocked because he didn't think she would like it. The man stood under the tree, looking at Evelyn. He said, "Once. Real flowers. Remember, one day I will bring you real flowers no matter what." And then the image of his dead body came back to me. He was lying on the ground in a pool of his own blood. Evelyn finally came out of her memories of this man. It was too tragic. Sitting in the Countess's arms, Sherry said, "They say blue daisies have a very pleasant smell. Shall we try later?" The girl looked ahead and answered calmly, "Good." Evelyn walked away from the hall, her silhouette moving away in the direction of the exit. The door suddenly swung open, rays of light streaming in. One of the servants burst into the room and exclaimed, "Go away, madam! We are in big trouble! All goods brought from the north are confiscated and searched." The military said it would hunt down reactionary elements. All ships were confiscated. Meanwhile, the carriage wheel braked sharply, raising a cloud of snow and dust. The flag with the coat of arms fluttered in the wind and shimmered with light. Evelyn frowned, her voice filled with anger. "They dare to search me?" The soldiers crowded around the main gate, looking serene and lighting a cigarette for their captain. Evelyn asked loudly, "Who dared?" She didn't know yet that this person was someone important. Standing before Evelyn was Gillas Black, an assistant to the Atteric army who had been in battle for over a year. Why is he working here? It seems he was assigned as a means of transporting supplies for the enemy. The man in dark clothes, holding his hands to his chest, said, "You must be careful. This gentleman, he is the devil incarnate, dressed in a military uniform. All his subordinates are afraid to even pronounce his name, so they simply call him Colonel." Two men stood in front of a large gate. One of them asked, "Should I pull him out?" The colonel stood in front of the building, holding a cigarette in his hand, and said, "No, I have to say hello first." The colonel stepped forward, his steps sounding firm, and the door opened with a loud creak, after which the soldiers entered the hall, holding their weapons at the ready. The aristocrat's eyes reflected confusion at such an unexpected raid on them. The man in uniform apologized, his voice mocking. He said, "Sorry for dirtying your door." The man looked at his shoes and said, "There was no time to clean the soles. Many years have passed." Evelyn looked at the colonel in shock, and the man continued, "The reception will not be cheap." Suddenly, her pupils dilated because she remembered this man. The Duchess remembered how several years ago she had looked at this man with a contemptuous gaze. He, covered in blood, grabbed her hand and begged for mercy. But Evelyn didn't even think about sparing him. She looked at him like he was trash that couldn't live on this earth. Then the man realized that he was being treated like a thing, and, gathering all his will, he said, "You will regret this moment for a long time, mark my words." Now that wounded boy had become a man in uniform. Adjusting his headdress, he said, "It's too late to say hello." Looking at Evelyn and Sherry, he added, "Long time no see." He called her Miss Evie. That made the girl tighten her fingers on Sherry's shoulder, after which Evelyn wanted to say something in response, but the colonel interrupted her. "Exactly! Now you're Mrs. Winter. How could I forget?" As soon as he took off his cap, Evelyn immediately examined his face. Her guess was confirmed. It was that same kid. The majestic palace towered over the snowy expanses. The snow-white domes sparkled in the sun. The flag fluttered in the wind. A voice spoke. In the name of the king. A group of officers stood in front of the gate. One of them said, "The Duchess of Winter is suspected of selling supplies." Because of the commotion, many people gathered around. One of the soldiers said, "All members of the ducal family are required to cooperate." The maid and the butler continued to stand there, confused. The butler said, "It doesn't concern us, right?" Evelyn's cane hit the ground with a loud thud. Someone exclaimed. Evelyn stood looking at the crowd and said, "Don't make a fuss. I won't be able to forgive you." Then the girl went up the stairs, followed by the maid, and added, "Bring me the same tea." Without reaching the end, she froze on the steps with a cold expression on her face. Discontent slid across her face. Meanwhile, the man stood in the middle of the chambers, holding a cigarette in his hands. He looked into the distance, thinking about something important. He approached the window, thoughtfully watching what was happening. The Duchess of Winter looked determined in his eyes. In fact, the Altaric monarchy was famous for its brave knights, but it was not always so. Thanks to the military might of the royal family, it survived among the great powers. But ordinary people continued to suffer from the ongoing military conflicts, and dissatisfaction with the royal family and the nobility grew ever worse. But like a falling star, a hero appeared. He achieved everything on his own. Gillas Black, unknown origin, black beast, demon of battle, dirty mercenary, a showy chess piece to calm down confused people. But no matter what, this man always won. He transformed from a commoner into a war hero and the only hope of the people. Meanwhile, Evie was drinking tea, and the man standing in front of her continued to bombard her with questions. "Where is Rowan Winter?" "Who?" "Rowan Winter." "I'm asking about the whereabouts of your husband." The lady raised her cup and asked mockingly, "How did an idiot who couldn't read become a war hero?" The young man frowned and replied coldly, "Despite the fact that the reports clearly recorded his death." Gillas continued speaking. "We didn't find the body." After these words, the girl froze in place, and then she screamed, "So you dare say that you dug up my husband's grave?" The guy took the papers in his hands and started leafing through them. "There are too many gaps in this situation. 10 years ago, you married Rowan Winter. 3 years later, he died in a train accident." Gillas focused his gaze on a point and continued, "What a tragedy. But witnesses to the incident do not understand why nothing was left of the body." Gillas picked up the documents and said, "The movement of funds for the last 7 years does not match the accounting book." The man then looked at Miss Evie and asked, "Did Rowan Winter fake his own death and try to secretly commit treason?" Evelyn raised her eyebrows in surprise, her gaze betraying confusion. Evelyn's mad laughter echoed through the room. She said, "What nonsense!" Having finished laughing, the girl leaned back in her chair and grinned. "Don't you think you should have become a writer instead of a soldier?" Gillas stepped forward and suggested, "Let's change the way the question is phrased. Why were you faithful to your dead husband all these years?" There were many opportunities to remarry. Then Evelyn didn't look at Gillas and answered reservedly, "Because I love him." Gillas looked away, considering her words. The girl with the cup lowered her eyes and added quietly, "Because I still love him." Evelyn continued to drink her tea calmly, as if nothing had happened. Gillas seemed strange to her. Gillas frowned at her answer and said, "That's funny." The man covered his mouth with his hand and said, "Devilish love. You could have become a writer yourself." Then she raised her cup sharply and asked with a hint of irony, "Really?" The lady suddenly sprinkled tea on the man's head. "I don't think it's funny." The soldier didn't know how to react to this and cried out, "What? Colonel! If you line up your soldiers and point your blades at me, do you really think I'll be afraid?" Evelyn and Gillas stood next to each other. Evelyn asked for evidence so as not to insult her husband. The teacup fell to the floor, spinning in the air, reflecting the tense moment. Evelyn was serious. Evelyn said, "I don't have time for these games. Get out now." The man then turned sideways, his face covered by a mask. He looked tired. The pompous staircase in the luxurious hall was filled with soft light, creating an atmosphere. Evelyn walked down the stairs, leaning on her cane. Her steps were majestic. She frowned, looking straight ahead, her gaze determined. Evelyn turned to Sherry. Evelyn asked, "Sherry, were you very scared?" The girl repeated the same thing. "Now everything is fine." But Sherry looked strange. Gillas stood right behind the smiling Evelyn. The girl could not notice him. The man looked at the girl. She turned to him. He said, "Madam," Gillas said, "there is something I have not mentioned." The girl turned to him with distrust. A man and a woman stood on the stairs. She said, "I don't want to listen." He replied, "You must listen to me." Contraband being transported to an enemy country on a transport ship was seized. Evelyn frowned when she heard, "If you do not prove your innocence, you will have to say goodbye to life." She looked at the man, smiling slightly, her lips trembling with suppressed emotions. After a moment's silence, she said, "It's old-fashioned to threaten when talking about death." He turned away, clearly hesitant. The lady looked at him defiantly and said, "You better get on your knees and beg for mercy, like before." The man knelt down in front of the girl, clutching her legs. He was covered in blood, after which he turned around, tears streaming down his face, leaving marks on his dirty skin. Evelyn said that if he didn't know how to do it, he should remember the old days. The young man looked at her attentively, his face expressing thoughtfulness. The colonel held the end of the cane confidently, holding it resolutely in his hand and not allowing himself to be hit. Then he took the cane from the girl, and she was seriously surprised by this. The soldier made a strange movement, pulling Evelyn towards him. She certainly didn't expect that. The man pressed Evelyn to himself, hugging her, and said, "Madam?" The girl was perplexed. The girl in the red dress stood and watched everything, and then the man asked, "The child is still small, isn't he?" Gillas approached Evelyn and whispered in her ear, "Please." But the blonde lowered her head, hiding her emotions. Her eyes sparkled with tension and anxiety. Then the man carefully extended his hand, and the girl allowed him to touch it. Gillas gently let go of the girl's hand, taking his time. His gaze was filled with sadness and regret. The man, walking towards the stairs, said, "Let's take a break for today. See you tomorrow." After which, the man left Evie and Sherry and went about his business. Evelyn looked at her interlocutor with surprise and concern. He threw out another phrase, "Lady!" On the floor near the stairs lay an abandoned cane, glittering in the light. Altric's most loyal subject. He was granted territory in the north, from which he made a fortune. The Duke's family was well off, and he did not hesitate to resort to illegal methods to expand his business. People in the crowd shouted insults. "How dare you? Aristocrats are too arrogant." But Rowan became the youngest and best graduate of the academy. He was an adopted child, which caused controversy. But 3 years later, he disappeared, and only his wife remained, Evelyn Winter. Instead of grieving over the loss of her husband, she continued her inhuman commercial expansion. The crowd screamed in outrage, "What is this? It's too expensive. This woman will destroy the family." Even if all sorts of gossip appeared, she simply continued to laugh at them. However, the Winter family's business began to gradually collapse. Due to the lack of a successor, the prestige of the duchy fell. The cup was abruptly placed on the table, leaving marks. The noise from the impact could be heard. Evelyn was sitting at the table. There were 2 people nearby. She asked a question. "What did you just say?" A military man sat opposite her and answered seriously, "I want to buy your title and lands," after which, deathly silence immediately fell in the huge hall. Then Lady Winter frowned and said, "How stupid! Do I look like I need money?" The young man with the papers in his hands explained, "The rate of gold production has decreased significantly." He then presented the documents to Lady Winter and added, "I would prefer to end this on my own terms." Evelyn stared at the documents, and suddenly someone said, "It is to your advantage, madam." She put the documents on the table next to the tea. "Please read them. You think you'll have support." The man looked at the papers and sighed. The other said, "This is not something you can resist." Sitting in a chair and leaning on her arm, she said, "Worried about me. How generous, Colonel." The man raised his eyebrows and said with a grin, "Then just sign it." Evelyn slapped the paper and screamed, "But the only one who can take pity on me. This is His Majesty the King. How dare you talk about profit?" Isak stood behind the man, looking around nervously. The girl said, "Isak, get ready." As soon as dawn comes, I will go to the royal castle, she said. The starry sky was covered with clouds. The luminous stars, hidden behind these clouds, were shining. The candle shone in the darkness of the room and seemed to be the only source of light on the frosty night. The woman sat by the window, holding a candle in her hand and looking at the dark sky. Her thoughts were full of sadness and thoughtfulness. Clutching the fabric of her clothes, she said, "Impudent devil." Her indignation clearly spoke of what had happened. Someone was approaching. "Do you think it will be that simple?" The Duchess's voice sounded distrustful. Evelyn sat in a chair, flying in her thoughts, and in the meantime, someone approached her. Evelyn turned sharply, her fist ready to strike. "Who's there?" But fortunately, it was Sherry who scared Evelyn to death with her appearance. Winter hit Sherry on the arm anyway, so she immediately ran up to the girl and asked, "Are you okay?" After which, having made sure that Sherry was okay, she sighed and said, "Calm down." After a while, she held Sherry in her arms and whispered. She finally calmed down. Looking at the child with alarm, she thought, "I obviously felt something." Sherry was sleeping soundly. Evelyn said softly, "Yes. No need to hurry." Holding Sherry close, she said, "I am the head of Winter. No one can take that away from me. Ever." At some point, the candle went out. Now a thin stream of white smoke was coming from it. They fell asleep, huddled together in the chair. Night was falling. After some time, Sherry woke up and looked sleepily at her mother. Evelyn was deep in sleep, her face expressing peace and fatigue. Sherry thought that she should wrap her in a warm blanket, because the room was not very warm. That's why the girl immediately and quietly ran for a blanket. She continued to sleep in the chair, not even noticing that the girl had gone somewhere. Then Dark Boots stopped at the chair where Evelyn was sleeping. Her peace was disturbed. It was the Colonel. He came up with a plate, his gaze directed at the sleeping woman. Looking at her, he heard her mutter something unintelligible in her sleep. Evelyn dozed and said quietly in her sleep, "Rowan." Her voice was barely audible. Gillas looked at her thoughtfully, his face remaining calm and cool. The Colonel came closer and said, "Wake up." Evelyn flinched slightly at his words. She rose from her chair, trying to understand what was happening. The Colonel said, "You haven't eaten anything today." Then he handed her the soup and calmly added, "Eat." Looking down, her face expressed tiredness and thoughtfulness. But the man said again, "Otherwise you will faint." But the Duchess made a face and answered discontentedly, "Bribing is bad. Take it away." Suddenly, the Colonel gently touched her face, running his hand over her cheek. He said, "You have a fever." The Colonel leaned closer, looking into her eyes and asked, "Does it hurt when you swallow?" After which she abruptly pushed his hand away and shouted, "What are you doing?" The girl looked at him with complete bewilderment in her eyes. "Before, when you were unwell, you wouldn't even take a bite." "It's a bad habit, madam." Looking at him with disgust, her voice sounded cold. "What are you trying to achieve?" The Colonel thought for a moment, then quietly repeated, "Revenge?" He continued, "Well?" Suddenly, he approached her with a spoon in his hand and said, "Doesn't this only work on a healthy opponent?" Evelyn frowned, her eyes shining with exhaustion. This wasn't something to do to someone so weakened. He reached out his hand to her, but she rose abruptly, pushing him away. Her movement was quick. Evelyn felt the Colonel's hand tighten around her neck, her eyes burning with anger. He grabbed her by the shoulders, holding her with force. She screamed. The Colonel looked at her with a cold gaze. He said, "Don't move. I thought you had more strength." She looked at him, her face filled with anger. Wasn't that too much? Gillas held a plate of food, but she hid her face in her hands. He said, "I don't have a spoon, but—" The Colonel leaned closer, his face very close. "There are many ways to feed you." The Colonel's finger touched her lips. The Colonel leaned toward her ear, his voice firm. "Don't resist." Her eyes widened in surprise. She couldn't believe what was happening. Then Evelyn remembered how passionately she kissed this very man. Her face turned red with emotion. But in reality, Gillas forcibly brought the plate of food to her mouth, and she screamed in fear. He held her head, insisting, "Throw away your useless stubbornness." Looking down, his gaze remained cold and penetrating. Life is about giving and taking. Gillas force-fed Evelyn, holding her face. She tried to hold back, but the food ran down her lips. She looked haggard and angry. Her face was dirty. Not too bad. She looks great. Rowan leaned down, his face set in determination. He wasn't going to stop. Sherry suddenly appeared behind Rowan with a determined expression on her face, her hands clenched into small fists. He turned around when he heard footsteps behind him, his gaze remaining intense and serious. The girl, clenching her teeth and frowning, pulled at her pigtails, expressing obvious indignation and rage. The little girl stood behind Rowan, and Evelyn sat in a chair nearby, her body slumped lifelessly. He walked up the stairs, addressing the Duchess. "Eat all you have left." Sherry leaned toward Evelyn, who was hugging her. "Or do you want to go to the palace on your own 2 feet?" With her head down, she looked down thoughtfully and depressed, her face expressing an internal struggle and fatigue. The dark mountains were visible against the sky. The rain poured down in sheets, creating an atmosphere of melancholy and emptiness. A woman in a blue coat and a man in a work apron stood under the awning. God! The hunt was going to be hopeless. They exchanged glances, their hands slowly meeting. Until the rain stops, the man and woman's hands continued to reach out to each other, the moment full of hesitation. The woman in the hat raised her head and looked forward, her face expressing uncertainty and indecision. Evelyn watched the man in the green apron, her gaze wary, as if she expected something from him. The man, slightly wet from the rain, spoke. "You could have stayed here. I'll call someone." She then took the man's hand, despite the falling rain, as if they had decided to stay together. "Are you sane?" the woman said. The man replied, "I'm worried you might catch a cold." The man, his face sunken, his hair wet from the rain, spoke. "You're lying. Your body is even hotter than mine." The girl carefully brushed the hair from the man's forehead. His cheeks flushed. The woman came closer. During a dialogue, people look into each other's eyes. "I think you should get a haircut." After her words, the man abruptly looked away, his eyes full of embarrassment and his face flushed. As he left, the man said, "I'll be quick." Evelyn shouted, "No, stay!" Evelyn looked serious. "Stay with me, that's an order." He looked away, his face showing hesitation and inner struggle. She stared at the man. Just one word from her made his gaze become absent-minded. The Duchess stood in front of him, holding his face and saying, "Don't forget, Gillas, you're mine." The woman brought her face closer to the man, her words sounding decisive. "You are the only thing I have." The man's hand clenched into a fist nervously, and he whispered uncertainly, "Yes, lady." The girl recalled these moments and did not understand what was guiding her then. She thought that his clumsy but powerful movements betrayed her stupid and handsome man. Evelyn snapped out of her memories. She was supposed to be heading to the palace today. One of the servants was sitting by the carriage. "I'm sure everything was fine until yesterday." The carriage broke down. She cursed with her cane and thought, "I had to get to the palace," someone said. "Any problems?" A black-gloved hand touched the handle of another carriage. A strong voice insisted on its proposal. The colonel stood by his carriage and invited the Duchess to go with him. Evelyn didn't even turn around. She turned to her servant. "Dylan, how long will the repairs take?" The man looked down, afraid of the lady's reaction, saying, "About 3 o'clock." She didn't have that kind of time now. Gillas and the Duchess in the black coat stood nearby. "Colonel, then, we'll leave in 3 hours." He looked away with a serious expression. A slight irritation was visible on his face. He remained silent. The colonel in the black glove grabbed her hand tightly, his gesture full of determination. The woman in the blue coat looked surprised, her eyes widening as her arm was grabbed. The man picked her up in his arms, her face expressing surprise and confusion. The woman in the blue coat looked at the stranger with bewilderment. "What the? I think you're mistaken." The man with a cold expression replied, looking ahead. "We're not going on a picnic." 3 servants watched what was happening, their eyes fixed ahead. He said, "You were supposed to accompany, but now I will carry you myself. Everyone is watching." The lady in the blue coat screamed in defiance, her face filled with determination. "Let go!" 2 soldiers in uniform stood nearby. One of them exclaimed, "How dare you touch with your dirty hands? This lady—" The gentleman looked at the situation with a serious expression. He said, "Can you take care of the situation?" A hand, clenched into a fist, appeared in front of the carriage door. Someone said, "I'll make you beg for forgiveness." The lady in the blue dress found herself on the floor of the carriage. She was stunned and screamed. Her eyes shone with determination. You should soberly assess the current situation. She watched the scene carefully, her thoughts betraying her anxiety. This man really. The subject in the dark coat stood opposite the woman in the carriage. Who should I feel sorry for now? The carriage wheel slowly began to move. She said, "Back off." They sat opposite each other inside the carriage. The atmosphere was tense. Gillas said sadly, "I'm glad you're feeling better." The man in uniform, holding a newspaper on his lap, said, "It seems yesterday's meal helped you." The lady in the blue dress sat opposite, holding a cane. "Don't be fooled. I think I'm going to throw up." He glanced briefly and sighed silently, unfolding the newspaper. "If you need it so much, please come this way. It will be a hassle if the carriage gets dirty." The woman looked away with a tired expression on her face, as if considering her next steps. "Are you always so cocky when you open your mouth? Your arrogance is off the charts," she said with irritation. Added, "In the past, you couldn't even look me in the eye." The man leaned slightly and said, "Definitely, in the past. I was just like that." He was about to rise from his seat, which clearly did not bode well. She was surprised. "I can't find anything in common between him and the one I knew." Evelyn noticed the absence of those traits she had once known in the man. There was no trace of him left. He sat with his head down, lost in his thoughts. The atmosphere around him was tense and quiet. The girl gripped the cane so tightly that her hand turned white, filled with emotion. "Why?" she asked. The girl threatened the man who was on his knees. "You don't leave when I tell you to. Let go." The boy on the ground defended himself, his face showing fear. "Lady, I don't know why you're acting like this." She pushed her hair out of her face, her expression turning somber, as the man said, "I was wrong." The three young men stood aside as the young man continued. "I'll do anything." The guy with a sad look said, "So please don't leave me." Evelyn looked irritated and confused. "You didn't understand me at all." She hit the young man sharply, saying angrily, "I don't want to see you, so get out already." After the blow, she remained standing with a serious face, and traces of blood appeared on her clothes. The man has his head down, and there are traces of blood on his face. He looked confused and surprised, his face and hair stained with blood. The black glove slowly extended, as if about to touch someone. A gloved hand gently touched the boy's head, checking his condition. The officer in uniform looked stern. His face was serious. There was someone's hand nearby. Gillas asked, "What are you doing?" He looked at the woman, holding her hand. The man stared at the girl, continuing his monologue. "I ask." Two black gloves touched each other, creating a sharp movement. She sat quietly, commenting on her actions and mentioning the unacceptability of the gestures of the man opposite her. Her look was stern as she said that the officer had bad habits from his master. The man looked at the woman with a serious expression. "You have no right to say that," the officer reported. "We have arrived. I will take you to the throne room, madam." The man in uniform said, "I don't think this is the time for a leisurely chat about old times," the officer suggested. "So let's put it off until next time." She nodded, not objecting. Evelyn sat looking at the outstretched gloved hand, as if waiting for a reaction. But she never responded. She looked surprised, her eyes wide open as if she had seen something incredible. Finally, they nailed it into place. The large white castle with towers was illuminated by bright sunlight. Evelyn stood in front of the man in uniform and answered briefly. "Number." She said that the old dirty stories had no meaning. The man listened without trying to argue. A man in uniform with a serious expression and yellow eyes watched her every move carefully. The lady was accompanied by a military man, and there were 4 more soldiers standing on the sides. The man in the red coat spoke of their last meeting at Rowan's funeral. She listened in silence. Evelyn stood there, and he said that time had not hidden her beauty. She smiled slightly in response to his words. Finally, Ice rose Alteric. His voice was laced with sarcasm. The man added with a smile, "He's coming straight into my arms." His gaze was confident, as if he had already won. The bright throne room, with gilded elements and a luxurious chandelier, shone in the rays of the morning sun. Evelyn and the officer entered the hall. The atmosphere was solemn, their footsteps echoing throughout the spacious room. Someone was approaching and speaking. God, how many years, how many winters? The voice sounded with a note of surprise and warmth. The man in the red uniform approached with a smile. I thought I had forgotten your face, madam. Evelyn said one word with displeasure. Archduke. The girl asked how he was feeling, and he suggested being less cold. He put his arm around her shoulders and said, If you're cold, why don't we have some tea first? Evelyn looked at him without turning her head. She looked indignant. Thank you for your words, but the first thing to do is to clear up the misunderstanding with His Majesty the King. The blue-eyed man smiled and said, About the misunderstanding, the elder brother is not. The chronic disease is worsened. It seems he is not in his right mind. He has been fighting the disease for a long time. He continued, Will a little misunderstanding hurt him? I'm very worried. The second prince looked down at the lady, causing her to feel uncomfortable. She stared at him with a look that was even more empty than one could imagine. You don't have to worry. Rest assured, I will make sure that no one harms His Majesty. The red-haired prince replied, Well, I hope so too. He pointed at the colonel and said, They throw themselves so enthusiastically into anything connected with the rebels. After such a remark, the man asked, And did you meet your friend on the road? He's a hero for saving me when I was fighting in Binswell. We had a hard time convincing him to come over. He continued to praise the colonel. This man has no equal in pursuit. Old habits die hard, and I'm afraid he may have been rude to you on the way. Not at all. It never occurred to me that he was a mercenary. He is such a gentleman. The girl decided to play along and also began to praise everything and everyone. Two wonderful gentlemen. Evelyn understood that she needed to flatter these people who were in front of her, who would lead Alteric in the future. She played it so well. I'm about to cry, I can't wait to see it. After this phrase, the servant entered the room and announced, His Majesty the King asks to come in. Evelyn immediately moved towards the door to have an audience with the king, but she was stopped. Wait, madam. A hand in a white glove reached out to her, as if wanting to stop her. No need to try so hard. Even if you fall, you can count on me any time. The prince touched the girl's hair and continued. Stains left in the past. He smiled before continuing to speak. These stains can be easily erased. Evelyn realized that he was pressing on her emotions now, but she was not so easily broken. She looked at him coldly, and a thought popped into her head. So it was you who killed my husband? The prince's face darkened suddenly. It seemed as if the girl had just revealed some important secret. Then Evelyn, as if nothing had happened, began to walk towards the open door of the king's chambers. She smiled brightly and turned all her words about murder into a joke. I'm just kidding. The red-haired prince and the gloomy colonel were left standing alone in the corridor. The king's chambers were very bright. The light from the lamps filled the entire room, making it less gloomy than the corridor. The girl stepped over the threshold and said, I'm coming in. The king stood up and asked, Mrs. Winter, is that you? She stopped at the very door and answered, Yes, Your Majesty. The king extended his hand and said, Come here. There were some strange black marks on his skin. He spoke, closer. The girl continued to look at his hand, which was clearly visible to her, and was perplexed. She came up and took that hand in hers, then leaned over and kissed it as a sign of respect. She looked at the king. Please forgive my incompetence for not meeting you earlier. Meanwhile, in another room of this estate, it was quite noisy and lively. The table with the jug and glasses turned over and fell to the floor with a crash, as if someone had pushed it. The red-haired second prince put his hand to his forehead and lamented. This bad woman. He continued talking to himself. You still act so arrogant. Apparently you still believe. The colonel sat at the table and sipped wine, paying no attention at all to the cursing prince. The prince continued to wail. You still don't believe that he could die so easily. An image of the woman's husband floated into his mind. Rowan Winter. He must still be alive. The king's chambers, unlike the other room, were quite quiet and peaceful. The king said, This is our first private conversation since his funeral. The girl answered. Yes, he said. He was a great man. I thought his talent led us to glory. Continued to say something nice, and then switched to another. Victor is very greedy. During his time at the academy, Rowan must have been an eyesore because he always came in first place. I heard about your situation. This must have been Victor's plan. He wanted to intimidate you and take you under his wing. He continued, "Don't confront him directly. You can't do this alone." The king's voice grew quieter. Even if Rowan was gone, it was not the end for the Winter family. Evelyn put her hand to her chest and asked with interest, "What do you mean?" Meanwhile, in the other room, the showdown continued. "Do you understand me, Black? We have to find him. Find his corpse. I'll tear him to shreds right before her eyes. Don't forget who helped you get this far." The prince said to the colonel, "I will give you a portrait of Rowan Winter. Let's go to my office." The colonel replied, "I saw." This surprised the prince. "Saw? What do you mean?" The dark-haired man with the glass in his hand repeated it again. "I saw him." His words sounded sincere. The red-haired prince asked, "What connects you?" "The more I learn about you, the more unfamiliar you seem." The colonel tried to see something in the glass of red wine and find the words for his answer. In the end, he decided to settle on something less significant. A portrait. "I saw it with my own eyes." Pictures of bygone times began to emerge in his memories. A glass of muddy water and a brush in it. He clearly remembered clutching the paint spatula in his hands. His sadness and anger knew no bounds. The colonel remembered how bitter tears flowed in streams from his eyes, and he could not accept it. That portrait. He was sitting in a room with only an easel as furniture. In front of him was a portrait of Rowan and Evelyn, painted by me. But he didn't dare say it. He just pushed the thought out of his head. The dialogue continued in the king's room. "All the blessings and glory of the Duchy of Winter belong to the living. As long as I'm here, this last barrier of the Altaric Empire will be alive and well. Give me a chance to make things right." The colonel raised the glass to his lips and said, "I will definitely find him." At the same time, Evelyn said to the king, "Let me prove it." Their goals were too different. The golden gates of the palace shone in the light of the lamps. The audience was over. Evelyn stood next to a man in a white frock coat on the red carpet. The second prince couldn't help but notice. "You've grown gloomy, madam." Victor walked up the stairs and asked about the conversation. "I hope your conversation went well." Evelyn and her companions stood, and he reminded them that they needed to return immediately. Victor expressed surprise, calling the king heartless for his decision about the widow. He offered to accompany Evelyn. She looked at him carefully. She looked quite strange. "I encountered such different attitudes towards her from one person." Victor extended his hand. The bastard son of a concubine joined the army and strengthened his position. Evelyn's eyes were wary. He, dissatisfied with the title of Archduke, wanted to take the throne. The man in uniform stood, preparing to realize his ambitions. It was difficult to gain support in the Altaric Empire. Victor extended his hand to Evelyn. He wanted to strengthen his position through Princess Winter. Then he offered to dance, but she politely declined. Victor touched her hand softly, calling out to her. His intention was quite clear. He declared that this was the last time he would make the first move. Evelyn looked at him coldly. Someone suddenly screamed behind Victor, "Uncle!" The people around watched what was happening in surprise. One of them asked what Victor was doing. Joshua Altaric, first in line to the throne, approached indignantly, blaming Victor for the woman's anxiety. Evelyn stood next to the stranger and asked, "Joshua, what is His Highness doing here?" The officer looked at Joshua with an expression of displeasure and tension. Then Joshua turned to Evelyn. "More importantly, madam, long time no see." His gaze was directed at Evelyn, and his face turned a little red. Evelyn bowed and replied, "It's good to see you again. I'm honored that you remember me." Joshua said, "Of course I remember you. I heard about the hardships you went through." The girl answered, "You don't need to think about that now. I heard that His Highness will graduate from the academy with honors." Suddenly, Evelyn approached Joshua and grabbed his hands, saying, "The graduates of the academy were the backbone of the Altaric Empire. This is a reason to be proud. I want to be a great man like Duke Winter." His voice trembled with excitement. Evelyn said, "My husband would be glad to hear it. Your Highness, may I ask you a favor?" She looked confused, admitting that she had no crew to return with. She mentioned the wolf attack. All this time, the unique military man stood and watched the situation without emotion. She asked to be allowed to use the carriage. She believed that there might be dangers ahead. Victor was slightly surprised to hear such a request from Evelyn Winter. The man in uniform watched carefully, his gaze remaining cold and distant. Of course, Joshua immediately agreed to her request. The girl said, "It's an honor for me." After which Evelyn, without letting go of his hand, knelt down in front of Joshua. And while Joshua didn't understand what was happening, Winter said, "I will never forget this favor, as long as Altric lives." And kissing his hand, she added, "The Winter family pledges allegiance to you." A group of men stood at a distance, watching what was happening. The soldiers stood nearby and thought, not only did she ruin the Archduke's plans, but she also trampled them into the mud. The white-haired man in uniform was in anticipation. What would happen next? Next to him stood the colonel, whose face usually expressed nothing. But now he was laughing, after which he noticed that the colonel was smiling, and did not understand why. Joshua then ordered the lady to be escorted to the carriage immediately. Victor leaned toward Evelyn and whispered, "Do you think you can chase two hares?" She looked away, her green eyes doubtful and thoughtful. And as Victor passed by, she replied, "It is better to be the hunter than to become the prey." Victor walked away on the red carpet, laughing loudly. "Funny, funny." Victor, looking into the distance, uttered a threat. "You will regret this." After which, the officer called out to her, calling her lady. The officer said they were near a conflict zone and offered to accompany her to the border. She said, "Should I have told you that the wolf pack was about you?" The man replied, "That's not necessary." This made the girl lose her temper a little. She looked at the carriage she was about to get into. The threshold was very high. Evelyn continued to stand in front of the carriage, not knowing how to get in there without making a fool of herself. The officer knelt down and said, "I will help." Evelyn looked at him with a little disdain and asked, "What are you up to?" He raised his head and said, "Nothing of the sort. As a gentleman, I only wish to help the lady." The girl's cheeks flushed. This made her memories return to the old days. The man held out his hand for Evelyn to lean on. There seemed to be no catch, but as soon as the girl had one foot in the carriage, something strange happened. At some point, she realized that she was falling somewhere down. It was unexpected and not good, he stated. The heel was broken. After all, he could see better what had happened there. He said, "You have had a lot of troubles lately. Please rest a little in the mansion." She looked at him with even more contempt. "Don't pretend to be worried. It's disgusting." The man didn't dare raise his head and mumbled, "I don't know how that might sound." Then he looked at her and said, "But I'm glad you're feeling better." She stared at the colonel with a look of complete incomprehension on her face. She couldn't believe what he had said, but the man continued to say some nonsense. "I am sincerely grateful to God." His words seemed as insincere as possible. Evelyn threw her shoe with a broken heel. She shouted at him, "Never show your face in front of me again." She looked angry. The carriage door slammed shut with a loud bang. Evelyn vented her anger in that movement. The white-haired man, who had been standing next to the colonel all this time, turned to him. He continued to look ahead, but addressed the dark-haired officer. "For some reason, you look pleased." The colonel had his back to him, so his emotions were not visible. "Really? I don't think so." He watched the carriage with Evelyn Winter in it drive away, unable to comprehend what had just happened. The man did not take his eyes off, thinking about something. "Do you remember what you taught me, lady? The highlight of the hunt is the very moment when the prey stops running and bares its teeth. The victim hopes to be saved." "I'm glad you're well." He couldn't stop thinking about her. The colonel also thought about her family happiness. "I'm glad you love your husband and child." Evelyn was asleep in the carriage at the time. "I'm glad you have honor to defend." He finished his thought by thinking, "I'm glad you still have something to lose." And it seemed like he wasn't as cold as he was trying to be. In fact, he still had feelings for her. The colonel couldn't take his eyes off the place where the carriage was. "Thank you, lady, for teaching me to love." Then he remembered how he grieved in the room with the portrait, and for showing the cruelty of love. The colonel smirked. His face showed no warmth. "I'll teach you a lesson." Meanwhile, the girl was animatedly gnawing her fingers under her gloves, sitting in the carriage. "For leaving me behind." The expression on his face was rather strange. He grimaced with disgust. "Thank you very much." The man with the documents was enthusiastically presenting his ideas. The construction was successful, but the locomotive exploded on the bridge, scattering debris and fire. The project was shelved. Isaac argued. Maybe there was a mistake in the plans. There could be threats from neighboring countries. Evelyn looked ahead confidently. Big words, Isaac. The plan is perfect. She stood in front of the bed, listening. Support him as a representative of the aristocracy. It will help. She bowed her head, saying, We will take care of the churches and salons. Evelyn was kneeling by the bed, her voice firm. That was good. A long-forgotten project will bring Alteric to the light, the man repeated. Evelyn placed her hand on her chest and said, I, Evelyn Winter, will renew it. Her gaze was full of determination. The fate of our family depends on this. Evelyn held the papers and said, I can't back down. She and Isaac approached the guards. One of them said, Sorry to interrupt, but access is restricted. 3 military men in strict uniforms approached. One of them asked, Could you show me your entry permit? The military man said with a grin, This is the first time I've seen business projects being implemented in such ruins. The man turned to her with a serious look. Could you please go back? Evelyn replied sharply, maintaining a cold tone. The project was entrusted to me personally by His Majesty. It is you who must go. She and Isaac and the soldiers came closer. Silence surrounded them. The wind howled over the ruined bridge. She handed the papers to Isaac and said, The documents are a mess. Bring the drawing after the modification. The man ordered the officers. Lieutenant, Junior Lieutenant, stay back, he warned her. Even if you are the lady of the Winter family, it is dangerous to be here alone. The officer looked at her sternly and said, Let's get down to official business. Evelyn looked away thoughtfully, her eyes downcast. She thought, They're obviously spying on me. The man with red hair smiled arrogantly. After the events of the Archduke affair, everything changed. The young officer sat on a chair and looked forward. I'm glad you feel better. She narrowed her bright eyes. I don't have time to worry about meaningless things. Evelyn looked up at the sky, her bright green eyes sparkling despite the freezing temperatures around her. She stood in front of the gloomy bridge. Now Evelyn extended her hand forward toward the tower. I must deal with the legacy Rowan left behind. She moved closer to the dark tower, leaning her head against the ruined bridge. The girl closed her eyes, trying to rest from the tension, but only Rowan was spinning in her thoughts. Huge stained glass windows illuminated the hall. The country is going through turbulent times. The voice repeated. The man in the waistcoat wrote in a book, holding a pen with a bright nib. We must develop free trade. Evelyn tilted her head, thoughtful. Remember, ladies, Brington Bridge. The man seemed to embrace her. He will be the light that will illuminate this dark time. The red bridge was falling apart, sparking and cracking, the structure crumbling under the pressure of time. The man with golden eyes froze, turning sharply, his gaze expressing excitement. The girl standing in front of the red tower heard a voice. Lady! Her gaze instantly filled with anxiety. Evelyn stood there, shocked by what was happening. Light and shadow fell on her face, emphasizing her fear. The sudden fall of the debris stunned everyone, and she and Gillas found themselves on the ground, protected from the debris. Gillas held Evelyn, who was breathing heavily after the fall. Are you okay? Her foot in the shoe touched the icy surface, sinking into a crack. The man with a cold gaze watched the situation. He was wearing dark clothes and holding her by the shoulder. You might freeze. Evelyn frowned and pressed her lips together, fear flashing in her eyes. Their fingers touched, but she immediately pulled her hand away. Evelyn, with green eyes, recoiled back. Don't touch me! Her voice sounded indignant. He dropped to one knee next to Evelyn. They were on cracked ice, with snow all around them. The man spoke confidently, looking at her. You can lose your toes because of your stubbornness. Evelyn replied with an icy tone, looking him in the eye. The only thing that needs to be cut off is your tongue. She sat in the snow, and the wind only grew stronger. The man had already risen from his knee, watching her. Evelyn turned around, his voice filled with concern. You don't want to freeze to death, do you? The man helped her up. The wind was getting stronger. Please, let's go. She looked at him, clenching her teeth. This guy. Gillas stopped and looked at Evelyn. We should wait out the snowstorm. They walked along a snowy path, the snowfall increasing around them. They came to a lonely house. Gillas pointed ahead. Right here. Before her stood an old hut in the snowy forest. Evelyn recognized it. Evelyn looked ahead in surprise. She thought, "This is the same little house." And then memories came flooding back to her. How several years ago they had retreated to this very hut. Everything around was creaking from the age of the materials, and sighs could be heard. And on the old bed, she and the young colonel kissed while sitting on top of him. But a lot of time had passed since then, so everything had already rotted and there were cracks in the house. After which they entered the house together, as they had then. But there was disorder around. There was a very strong snowstorm outside, so the idea of waiting it out in the hut was the best. Entering the room, the Duchess sat down, and the colonel, examining the hut, said, "Until the snowstorm stops, we will sit here." Snow swirled around the wooden house with a chimney. He put his hands in his pocket and said, "We need to get some firewood to start the caster." Gillas looked forward and was immediately plunged into memory as well. After all, in front of him was the very same bed on which they had kissed together, but now there were ruins there. Evelyn didn't want to go back to the old way and said, "I've long forgotten this place." Gillas examined the book he had found and, throwing it into the fire, replied, "And indeed," after which the fire flared up even more strongly. The crackling of flames filled the room. Throwing books on the fire to keep it going, the colonel asked, "Don't you need to dry your clothes?" Sitting with her back to the fire, she muttered discontentedly, "I have a feeling of déjà vu." Then the man sat down and answered, "It's not worth it. Or have you forgotten that I'm a soldier?" Evelyn tilted her head mockingly and said, "A soldier? More like a child with a knife." After this, Gillas immediately stood up and looked down thoughtfully. For some reason, Gillas extended his hand towards Evelyn, after which he abruptly grabbed the girl's hair and sniffed it, enjoying the aroma. Evelyn grabbed her hair, startled by Gillas's actions. Her eyes widened in surprise. The girl answered thoughtfully, "I can even walk home alone." "Stop it," the man said mockingly, rolling his eyes. "In that case, you'll freeze to death." The woman smiled slightly and covered her face with her hand. "The Archduke will like this." The man raised his head, expressing boredom. "You talk so boringly." The man turned his gaze to the dilapidated roof, in which many holes were visible. The boy's yellow eyes dimmed and became more cloudy. He frowned slightly. The man said, turning away from the girl, "This place reminds me of old times." The girl looked up at him with a surprised look in her green eyes, with which she carefully studied him. The man said, as if asking her, "After all, what's done can't be undone." The girl finally decided to turn around and frowned, asking the man again, "What?" The man lifted his chin and asked arrogantly, "Do you really love Rowan Winter? Can you handle this on your own?" He asked, coming closer. He asked, "Does he really love you? And is he okay with putting his love in danger?" The girl screamed, interrupting him because she didn't want to listen anymore. "Stop it," she said. "That's a strange question, Colonel. Why do you ask as if he were alive?" The girl asked in bewilderment, leaning over. "You are like that. Are you really loyal to the Archduke? The war hero was kicked out of the capital. Maybe you're just pretending?" the girl reasoned. Then the girl extended her hand, dressed in a black glove, to the guy. She stroked Gillas's cheek, saying, "I see you don't really believe in yourself." The man answered thoughtfully, watching her. "I don't think it's any of your business, lady." The girl told him plaintively, "You are like a dog that cannot bite its owner." The guy grabbed her hand, saying, "You are so suspicious and pushy. Is that noble?" The girl laughed, turning away from him. "You asked if I loved?" "Of course I did," said the girl. Her snow-white hair fell over her face. She grabbed the man by the shirt, saying, "Our relationship has been blessed by God." She kept repeating fearfully, "This is not something that can be simply ignored." But then the man took her by the shoulders and sat her down on a chair that was very close. The man turned away from the girl wearily, almost rolling his yellow eyes. He looked tired. His gaze fell on the old bed. The snowstorm was gradually receding, which was visible through the slits. That day, the man said, completely lost in his memories. His pupils became cloudy. He remembered the blonde hugging him and kissing him. He kept saying, "Even after doing this here." The man asked, puzzled, as if he was angry, "You still wore a white dress on your wedding day?" The man kept repeating, "Shamelessly declares chastity." The girl got up from her chair. "Did you swear your love in front of everyone?" the man asked. And the girl snapped. "Shut up!" His face clouded with anger, and the man finally spoke. Swearing with a mouthful of lies? But in response, he received only a slap in the face from the girl, who looked angry and spiteful. The girl's gaze immediately changed, became more tired as she repeated, "I told her to shut up." The man ran his finger across his lips, telling the girl, "You'll never get to heaven, lady." The angry girl slapped the man again. He didn't even try to resist. She repeated, closing her eyes, "You act as if you are attached to your dirty past." "It's vulgar," the girl insisted. Gillas didn't even dare look at her. But it didn't last long. A moment later, he ran his hand over his bloody lip. I haven't even mentioned anything vulgar yet," the man said, pressing his bloody finger to her lips. The girl's gaze immediately changed. She was angry when the man smeared blood on her lips. Then, in the blink of an eye, everything seemed to lose its outline. The roof of the building floated. The girl was lying on the ground, but she was trying to get up. She was breathing heavily, watching something below. There was a man lying underneath her, studying her carefully with his yellow eyes. He asked, "What would Rowan look like if he saw this?" The girl recoiled in surprise. But then, instead of being confused, the girl immediately touched his neck. She said, holding his neck tighter, "You can find out for yourself in the afterlife." The man's yellow eyes were completely expressionless. They were, as always, indifferent. The man then started taking something out of his pocket, saying, "Excuse me, lady, but it's not time yet." He pulled a pistol from under his vest pocket. Its barrel glowed brightly, as if with a flame. The girl's green eyes widened, clearly not expecting this. The man said, "Between a noble couple. Where is the place for the low class?" the man asked, pointing his gun behind the girl's back. To the girl, it looked as if a gun was pointed at her. She was scared. There were two people depicted in the painting. It was a lady with her beloved husband. After completing the portrait, the man had another plan. He held a special device in his hand. The man was planning to escape, but first he needed to finish the painting. Suddenly, a girl approached him. She said, removing her tattered hood, "Don't you dare leave me without permission." Then the girl grabbed the guy by the shirt, pulling him closer. His eyes only widened. The girl said sternly, "Don't even think about it." She looked determined, and the guy looked scared. The girl suddenly kissed Gillas, which made him cry. He himself did not understand why the tears were flowing. "She breathed life into me. She persuaded me not to kill myself," the man recalled. "But my life has changed since then," he recalled. He also remembered the face of the girl with the whip. "I have such a miserable freedom," the man thought, lying on the seashore. His back was wounded. The man suddenly grabbed the sand as if it were his last hope, pulling himself together. He stood up, swaying slightly. The man thought, "If so, then I will live." He walked closer to the seashore. "So that my desire to live is not a lie, I want to do," he thought, stepping into the cold water. Tears began to flow from the man's eyes as his gaze became more severe. He thought, "I will live to take revenge on you." Only on the battlefield, in military uniform, his steps were more confident and sharp, impressive. Their commander shouted, "Direction for 11 o'clock. We hold out until reinforcements arrive." Suddenly, a red-haired man addressed Gillas. "Thanks to you, my life is saved." His blue eyes sparkled as he said, "This is the first time I've seen you. What's your name?" This question stumped the man. He even managed to think about it for a bit, looking into the distance. He remembered the girl's face when she spoke. Boring, no name even. "Let me give them to you," the man said. "Gillas Black." He knew, "I will survive." His face was covered in wounds. They answered him. "This is the name of a modest man, betrayed by fate several times." There was an explosion. The man always thought about it. "I will definitely survive." Even now, slowly taking out the gun, the man then pointed the gun straight at the blonde, whose expression immediately changed. He immediately took the gun barrel away from her, his eyes wide open and thinking, "I'll point a gun barrel at you." Two men in blue uniforms were chatting, but one suddenly became scared, asking, "What's going on?" The second man's violet eyes immediately changed. He began to look into the distance, after his comrade. Somewhere far away, in the forest, as if from the sky, A huge fiery light from a gun was rising. The man said, "That's all?" He asked, "Inform headquarters?" The other replied, "Don't make a fuss, Junior Lieutenant." Then the blonde walked away, leaving Henry at a loss. He kept saying, "Better get the carriage ready." In a completely different place, a landline phone rang. It buzzed quite loudly. Winter's governess answered. "The head of the family is absent," she was answered. "Are all the people of Winter prim?" "There is no point in sending a gift," he kept saying. The woman asked, "Who is speaking to me?" Realizing who she was talking to, the girl opened her brown eyes wide. On the other end of the line sat a man with long red hair. He barely smiled as he spoke. Then he smiled brightly, narrowing his eyes. It seemed he had already arrived. The man almost laughed. "Isaac, what happened?" asked the man anxiously, who could barely walk. Isaac said, "I was attacked on the way. They took all my documents. Sorry, it's my fault." The man fell to his knees, right at the aisle, speaking. The lady remained there alone. But someone appeared in the aisle. There were 3 men, 2 in blue suits and 1 in red, who held a message from the Archduke. The governess asked again, still on the phone. Isaac looked angry and furious. Meanwhile, a cloud of smoke appeared in the low building, which was built from old boards. The girl stood up, but still couldn't take her eyes off the gun barrel in front of her. She was scared, the man said, getting up from the floor. "It's just a signal. You're surprised?" he asked the confused girl. The man stood up as a soldier entered, saying, "Colonel, I'm here to pick you up," the man said, holding out his hand to the girl. "Let's go, I'll take you to the mansion." Only then did the girl turn around. She frowned as she said, "You've missed your chance, Colonel. It's a shame we won't have another chance to see each other." But the man said arrogantly, squinting his yellow eyes, "So the news hasn't reached you yet." A man on the phone kept saying, "There's one more gift left." He said it as if he'd forgotten. The red-haired man laughed brightly, saying, "As you know, the lady lacks sociability." The man continued to repeat, "I am lonely now." The old woman just looked out the window in confusion. He showed his blue cunning eyes, saying, "Because I sent her my friend." The woman didn't know how to react at all, and so she just frowned. "The estate you're selling." "I bought it," said the red-haired man, imagining the abandoned estates in the north, where it is always cold. "There will be a ball in 15 days, said the man in the red suit, holding out an envelope. There was one important letter on a huge tray. The man said, "The owner is the new owner of the estate." "Colonel Gillas Black!" the man exclaimed. The estate was rather gloomy, though beautiful. Hearing these words, the blonde opened her green eyes wide, trying to comprehend all the new information. She asked, still kneeling, "The Archduke has granted you territory." The man narrowed his yellow eyes, telling her, "To your regret, it will be very ugly. If you, as a neighbor, do not attend this ball." The man extended his hand to the girl, and she froze in place. The man in the jewels kept saying, "The Archduke asked me to pass this on. This is not an invitation," he added. And at the same moment, the elderly woman hung up the phone from the red-haired man. He just calmly looked out the window, observing what was happening and talking about something. The man with blue eyes smirked slightly, raising one eyebrow higher than the other. He looked sly. Then the girl grabbed the man's hand, barely touching his palm. Obviously, for the sake of decency, she pulled the hem of her dress closer to her and said, "In 15 days." The girl looked stern, and her gaze was cold. "I will wait impatiently." The weather was raging again. Snowfall swirled in a fast dance of winter, enveloping everything around. The old woman screamed, asking, "Madam, are you okay?" She almost ran to the lady. "We just got a letter." The old woman screamed. But Gillas had already helped the blonde get to the estate. The man looked sternly at the old woman in front of him, slightly narrowing his yellow eyes, as if arrogantly. The 2 girls immediately froze in place in bewilderment. They opened their eyes wide, not understanding what was happening. She said to the guy indifferently, "I have things to do, so I can't treat you. You can go." The man narrowed his eyes, then bowed slightly, placing his hand on his chest. "Okay, see you later." Then the Archduke rode back in the carriage, heading towards the estate. The girl remained with the maids. The old woman asked worriedly, "Madam, are you hurt?" The girl answered, "I'm fine." Then the girl turned away, watching the other man, and said, Isaac is much more important now. There was a man standing in front of her with a big bruise on his cheek. He kept saying, It's my fault. I'm sorry. The girl watched him carefully with her green eyes as the wind blew through her hair. She took the cane and said to the maids behind her, Prepare the bath and the doctor. Then the girl put her hand to her forehead and frowned slightly, squinting her eyes. The girl said, Call Oscar. After a while, she was in the bath. She sat in the water with rose petals, hugging her knees as if trying to calm herself. She thought, 15 days later. Then she narrowed her eyes, tilting her head. She remembered the Archduke's words. It would be unseemly if you, as neighbors, did not attend this ball. Winter's lands are very close, and he buys the mansion knowing this. The girl realized, remembering the estate. She thought, remembering the two annoying men. They want to destroy the Duchy of Winter. The girl narrowed her eyes slightly, thinking about what might happen in the near future. Rowan kept repeating in her memories. After the king leaves us due to illness, the struggle for supremacy will begin, the pressure will become more intense, help will be needed. Rowan kept saying, Unfortunately, there aren't many people around us that can be called friends. The girl leaned closer to the bathtub, hugging her knees, remembering Rowan. She clenched her fists, clearly understanding. Enemies are everywhere. Her gaze became more direct and determined. The servants were shaking with anxiety. Silhouettes appeared in her memory, which could barely wipe away tears. A woman with long blonde hair leaned towards her reflection. Drops of water flowed down quietly. The spacious room with a high ceiling was illuminated by a luxurious chandelier. You felt the same way too. A woman with loose blonde hair lay in the water, her eyes looking straight ahead. A woman in a black dress stood in front of a tombstone. When there is no one to rely on, only yourself. Under the water, Evelyn lay with her eyes closed. The air bubbled, enveloping her in calm. Through the shimmering water, she hugged her knees and said, I am alone. Her body sank into the water, and her hair spread out around her. Someone's hand touched her. Suddenly, Evelyn rose from the water, her face expressing surprise, and her hand covering her shoulders. It was Sherry who was watching the Duchess in surprise. Evelyn turned to the girl and asked in surprise, Sherry, what are you doing here? Suddenly, there was a sharp splash of water, and Sherry fell into the bathtub. Soon she lifted the wet Sherry out of the water and said sternly, Your clothes are wet now. Evelyn looked down, her hair hiding her face. She was silent, as if trying to comprehend something. Sherry ate as she held back her tears, while Evelyn held her hands. Evelyn's gaze changed, her face reflecting the anxiety caused by the sudden situation, after which Evelyn hugged Sherry tightly and very warmly and pressed her close to herself. Don't worry, Sherry, Evelyn said, stroking the child's hair, trying to calm her down. She thought that she would never run away like a coward. Awareness and determination appeared in her eyes. In her memory, there was special equipment for the artist lying on the wooden floor. She looked at Sherry and said, Because I made a promise. Her words sounded firm and confident. The crystal chandelier in the hall sparkled in the light. The sound of a falling object could be heard. The woman lifted the child out of the water. It's time to get out. The water has already cooled down. Evelyn sat with the child in her arms, and the man screamed, You are crazy to leave the patient. The man with disheveled hair screamed, You left the patient unattended. The doors of the hall swung open. Golden light filled the room, emphasizing the richness of the interior. The doctor stepped inside with irritation. He said, I, as a doctor, cannot tolerate this. Evelyn stood with a serious expression on her face, holding Sherry's hand. The girl looked wary. The medic kept repeating worriedly, You are so pale. Do you have a fever? The doctor checked the woman's health with a serious expression, holding an instrument on her forehead. A lady with long hair angrily hits a doctor for his actions, causing a sound. Evelyn said sarcastically, Do all doctors not observe etiquette? A medic sitting on the floor smiles with a stethoscope around his neck and asks, Oscar Cole? She replied, There is no point in such communication anymore. It is better to stop it now. Oscar laughed. You always knew how to put an end to any situation, the doctor said. How nice to realize that an old friend has remained the same as before. They were walking somewhere together. Evelyn had already managed to change her clothes, and the doctor was telling her something. Oscar and Evelyn stand by the window, rays of light falling on them, creating an atmosphere of coziness. A man in a dark robe, with his face covered, holds binoculars as snow falls around him. A dark cloak hides the figure, snow swirls around, golden binoculars glitter in the hands. A luxurious room with green curtains, wood paneling, and a glass bookcase. Oscar holds a cup of tea, asking in surprise. A question about the reconstruction project. Two people are sitting on a green sofa, discussing business. The man asked, "Is this business related to Rowan?" Evelyn asks, "Is there something wrong?" Her gaze is wary, and in her hands is a cup of tea. The interlocutor answers nervously, emphasizing, "That's not the point." His gaze is confused and worried. Tall buildings, a waterfall is visible. Loud calls for freedom of the people are heard from the crowd. A man with a fist and a scarf demands the expulsion of the aristocrats. The crowd supports him with shouts. He insisted, starting a big business at such a time could cause public disapproval. Evelyn, wearing a lace dress, listens to her interlocutor, her gaze embarrassed but calm. The girl said, "Why are you talking to me so formally again?" I noted with sadness. "You no longer call me by name, as you used to." Evelyn added quietly, "I miss the old days when things were simpler between us." Oscar only managed to open his mouth slightly in response, as if surprised by the words of the girl in front of him. Three people are relaxing in a garden near a fountain, with fruits, drinks, and books laid out nearby. Oscar, sitting in a chair, smiles, remembering the time that he considers happy. Evelyn looks away with green eyes, her gaze expressing slight surprise. Someone's hand carefully opens the door, looking inside the room where conversations are taking place. A little girl with green eyes and blonde hair in a green dress enters the room. Oscar picks up the girl, laughs happily, and praises her. "You've grown so much!" He holds the girl in his arms, hugging her close, in response to a comment about her behavior. A woman in a smart dress and lace glove drinks tea, remembering the girl as a child. Oscar asked, "How old are you? Did you get the gift your uncle sent you?" "Oscar! You can call me that," he said, and the girl only widened her eyes in response. She grabbed the man's shirt lightly, squeezing it into a childish fist. Oscar watched in surprise. The doctor let her go, saying, "You don't have to tell me if you want. Maybe we can look at the rabbit together?" Having received consent, Oscar could only watch her go, observing her figure with burning eyes. He kept saying, the shock from that time had not yet passed. Even though she was very little when it happened, Evelyn couldn't speak for the first few moments. This event was a blow. The girl couldn't get the image out of her head, where blood was visible on the asphalt, along with fallen leaves. The man kept saying, squeezing the crying girl, "I should have done this earlier. Don't move." And then a man pointed a golden gun. It was clearly not the man who had grabbed the little girl. The man kept saying, "If you move a finger, I will kill your daughter." Evelyn grabbed Rowan with the gun. The voice was full of fury. "Rowan Winter!" But he only opened his blue eyes wider, firing his gun. And then Evelyn, with trembling hands, decided to grab the mug of tea, saying, "If it weren't for Rowan." But she still couldn't hold the mug, which caused it to fall to the ground with a crash. The girl recoiled. Oscar leaned over to Evelyn, saying, "Are you okay? You'll get hurt. I'll clean it up myself." Evelyn bowed her head, but then the man looked up at her with surprised turquoise eyes. It was as if he had just realized something. Oscar noticed that she was shaking with fear, with a small tremor. She narrowed her eyes slightly. He asked worriedly, "When was the last time you slept well? And when did you eat?" Then Oscar lightly touched her head, and she immediately began to shake it, covering her eyes. He asked Evelyn worriedly, "Did something happen?" His gaze was full of concern. And then Evelyn looked down, her green eyes clouding over as her hair fell over her pale face. Then she remembered that stern man whose yellow eyes sparkled brightly and menacingly. Evelyn grabbed Oscar's hand, enveloping it. She spoke to him quietly. "Oscar," the girl repeated, carefully studying the face of the man who got up from the floor. "I have a favor to ask." Meanwhile, outside the window of that place, the snowfall had already passed. All that was left was wet snow, which was easy to play with. That's why Sherry decided to go for a walk. She put on a coat and hummed something along the way. And then Sherry suddenly noticed a white bunny in front of her, looking at her intently. The girl immediately had a picture in her mind of Oscar and Evelyn rejoicing over her hair. And so Sherry ran after him, but suddenly and quickly, an arrow hit the hair. The girl froze in place. Red blood splashed on her, and Sherry was confused. Suddenly, someone addressed her. A child. This person was holding a black weapon in his hands. A tall man in a black robe stood over the hare's corpse and asked, "Do you remember me?" Meanwhile, a scream was heard from the huge estate, which could be heard even behind the house. "Wait!" Evelyn grabbed Oscar, who kept saying, "Calm down, Evelyn," she demanded. "Explain what's going on?" Evelyn kept saying, "You're the only one I can trust. They're trying to destroy our family." The doctor frowned, and his eyes became more stern. He put his arm around her shoulders, asking, "Who?" And then Evelyn remembered that brunette with yellow eyes, who wanted to point the gun at her. The girl pressed herself closer to Oscar's chest and continued to repeat. He came back. Her voice was trembling. Oscar asked in confusion, "Who are you talking about?" But he was interrupted by the maid. "Mistress." The old woman kept saying, "Mrs. Sherry." Her eyes were worried, and she was breathing heavily. And then the two friends turned around in fear. They opened their eyes wide, watching the woman. After which, before the girl's eyes were high mountains, whose slopes were already filled with heavy snow and ice. However, she didn't even put on a coat or jacket. She just ran out of the estate, looking around in fear. Furry headphones that belonged to Sherry appeared in her field of vision. But there was blood nearby. 4 people approached the scene cautiously, slowly getting closer. But then the girl's gaze changed completely, became empty. She no longer tried to warm herself up. People were whispering around Rowan's coffin. The Winter family was cursed. Following the previous chapter, even Rowan. After that, people kept saying, "No, the problem is this woman. How did she come about? Her cousins are dying." The girl could only lower her gaze before the tombstone. "She must be a witch," people kept saying. And then the sunlight brightly penetrated through the windows, illuminating everything around. The girl was lying on the floor, still wearing the black dress with the photo. She was looking at the window in front of her, at the trees, but suddenly a small, surprised girl with bright green eyes entered the room. Closing her eyes, the girl said, "I told you not to let anyone in. Apparently, no one listens to the witch." Curling up on the floor, she said thoughtfully, "Go away." Her voice was tired and strained. Then Evelyn asked, "Do you know who your mother is?" The girl's eyes widened even more, and her bangs fell over her face. She said, "When I was young, I killed my cousins and ate my uncle for dinner. I burned everything that was nearby to the ground." Then the girl put her hands on her stomach and said, "I am a monster that eats people. So go away now." But the little girl didn't seem to even think about it. Sherry just put her hand on her mother's head. She took off Evelyn's black veil, revealing the girl's tortured face. There was a deep scratch on her cheek. And then the little girl crouched over her mother's body, and also smiled slightly, touching her with her hands. Looking thoughtfully at the girl noted how her palm rested on her wounded cheek. It seemed like the girl was comforting the monster so that it wouldn't cry. The girl reasoned, looking at Sherry's upset face. And then those eyes, Evelyn remembered. Only her eyes were already drooping because they were so exhausted. They remind me of that happy time that I loved so much. The girl recalled the bright trees. Her eyes narrowed and her brows furrowed. She turned her thoughts to Sherry. She imagined herself hugging the girl and reasoned. Life began, like a dry branch. My last spring. But now, before the girl's eyes, there were only cold, winter lands. It was snowing heavily. The maid who was following the blonde said loudly, "We sent the guards to search everything around." The woman kept saying, "Madam, at a time like this, you must remain calm." Evelyn's gaze was exhausted. She felt sick, but they kept telling her. The kidnapper knew the area well. "I hope Sherry is okay." Looking only forward, she saw only a frozen river in front of her. And then the blonde opened her green eyes wide. Her light hair was already tousled by the wind. On the other side of the river, Rowan stood in front of her, with a little girl clinging to him. The maid kept saying, "They'll find her for sure, but you need to calm down." Evelyn immediately ran across the river. The old woman kept repeating, confused, "You shouldn't go there. It's dangerous." "Madam," she frowned. In front of her, whose eyes were now burning with a bright green fire, looked forward with hope. Her gaze fell on Rowan's face. It was rather blurry, but Evelyn had no doubt. It was definitely him, after which the girl threw herself into the icy water because the ice beneath her had cracked. The maid screamed and called her. She just opened her green eyes wide, thinking, "It can't be." There was a cape on her shoulders. But then Rowan took the girl's hand, and they walked away from Evelyn, who was silently begging, "Don't go!" She came closer and closer, the hem of her dress floating in the river. It couldn't be Rowan, she reasoned. The girl had already crossed the river, so she climbed onto the bank, saying, "Sherry, don't go with him." But Rowan kept going, saying that she was all she had left. Evelyn begged, "Please." Looking at his face, she prayed. But then she screamed sternly, her eyes wide, "Are you going to curse me too? Then take me away!" With a trembling hand, the girl reached for the hem of the man's coat. She screamed, "Better take me!" And then she opened her green eyes wide in fear, because she finally realized something. As if in a daze, she looked up at the man in front of her. Evelyn was kneeling in front of him, clutching the girl. Gillas stood before her, his face covered by a black mask, holding a huge hunting revolver in his hand. The man's gaze, as usual, was stern. He only looked at the frightened Evelyn. However, the barrel of the gun was stained with blood, which the woman immediately noticed, even in this state. She looked up at the man with a frightened expression, and then began to rise from her knees, watching his actions. Evelyn's shoulders shook as she tried to force something out, still keeping her eyes on the man in front of her. But the man with yellow eyes also did not look away, carefully studying her emotions and feelings. The woman barely audibly said, "No way." She raised her head even higher, and her pupils narrowed. And then the man bowed before her, touching his uniform. It was obvious that he was getting ready to go hunting. After this, Gillas opened his black cloak, from behind which Sherry peeked out, tightly clinging to his leg. Gillas said calmly, "While hunting, I noticed a suspicious man and shot him, but because of the snowstorm, I missed him. Even just hearing about it again, the little girl couldn't hold back her bitter tears of fear." And then Evelyn sank to her knees again, opening her arms to her frightened daughter. Seeing this, the little girl immediately rushed to her mother, running away from the indifferent Gillas. She hugged her daughter tightly, trying to stop her from shaking, and the man just calmly watched this scene. Soon a maid came running up to them, shouting, "It's dangerous now because of the snowfall. We need to get back to the mansion." Behind the maid walked a man who again said indifferently, adjusting his black collar, "Because of you, my hunt was ruined." The girl thoughtfully opened her eyes, looking at the snow beneath her. She could not utter a word in response, but she still said quietly, hugging Sherry tighter, "Thank you, I lost." Her voice sounded empty. Evelyn ordered, "Take the colonel to the mansion. We should compensate for the ruined hunt." After that, the man lifted his chin higher. His eyes lit up. "It's an honor for me, lady." Then he turned away from Evelyn. Two servants were helping the child, and the woman was suddenly addressed. Oscar shouted excitedly, "Are you out of your mind? Crossing the river in the snow. You don't feel well as it is." The man stopped suddenly, his turquoise eyes wide. He raised his eyebrows high. In front of him stood Hylas, who looked sternly at the man, towering over him. But it didn't last long. Oscar walked around Hylas, who immediately said, "Sorry." He didn't pay attention. Only after several meters from the brunette's figure did the man finally turn around, thinking. Looking at the man, Oscar suddenly became even more surprised, finally understanding who was standing in front of him. At this time, the man again plunged into memories of that day when the sun shone brightly over the horizon. Rowan was reading books, and Oscar was lying in the garden among food and alcohol. The girl in the middle was holding an umbrella. However, there was one other person who was not participating in their pleasant conversation. He was behind the canvas. The man's gaze was exactly the same as it was now, stern and cold. Yellow eyes studied them carefully. Meanwhile, Oscar watched Hylas, who had taken a few steps away from the man. Evelyn was sitting next to the doctor. There was a cup of tea on an elegant saucer, and a golden teapot gleamed on the table. A soft sound was heard. The servant bowed to the guests and said, "This black tea is made from the highest quality leaves." At this time, The woman with her hair smoothed down stood with a worried look. She quietly exhaled. Meanwhile, the guests were sitting at the table with an exquisite tea set. The servant added, "Then have a good time." The fair-haired interlocutor raised his cup in surprise and asked, "You are Colonel Black, aren't you?" The Marquis continued to hold the cup of tea with a cold expression on his face. The interlocutor clarified, "If I'm not mistaken." The man with golden eyes lifted his cup and answered, "That's right, Marquis Cole." The guy immediately exclaimed, "So it really is you! I didn't even recognize you!" "Colonel, this is amazing." The Marquis turned to his interlocutor, still holding the cup. He said calmly, "Thank you. Is Marquis Cole at peace now?" The man laughed, throwing his head back. He replied, "Don't call me that. It's like you've excluded me from the family." "At this time," Evelyn said. "At this moment, I must say thank you for saving my daughter, Colonel." Colonel Black responded, "No thanks needed. Do you have any suggestions?" Evelyn, sitting with her cup, looked straight ahead. He continued, "It seems you have too many enemies, lady." Evelyn took a sip of tea, her gaze becoming wary. "Thank you for your concern. Do you need anything in return?" The Marquis crossed his leg and raised his cup. He said, "If there is any problem with the ball, I can help." The boy with the golden eyes turned around and added, "By the way, Marquis Cole, why don't you go to the ball too?" He continued, "The lady has no suitable partner for the evening, but if she is accompanied by an old friend." The Marquis thoughtfully raised his cup and asked, "Wouldn't your husband be happy?" The cup of tea suddenly fell to the floor, shattering into pieces. The sharp sound pierced the silence of the room. The girl said quietly, "Rude?" Although the world has changed a lot, such a thing as status still exists, as before. Then she added, "Avoid thoughtless words and actions, Colonel." The man nodded and replied, "Yes, I beg your pardon." At this time, the Marquis folded his arms and thought. He calmly remarked, "Living on the battlefield, it is difficult to maintain culture and etiquette." And then he added, "Those who were drunk with victory. I have watched them countless times." Evelyn and her interlocutor sat silently on the sofa. A tense silence could be felt between them. The Marquis looked down with a cold gaze. He said quietly, "I keep forgetting my place." Soon the guy left, leaving Evelyn and the man on the couch. The silence was broken only by his confident steps. Walking up to the window, he put his hands behind his back and said, "You asked if I wanted anything else." Meanwhile, Evelyn, sitting next to the young man, asked a question. "Could you give me a room?" The snowstorm outside filled the room with an uneasy atmosphere. The wind howled and beat against the glass. Gillas, standing at the window, noticed, "I think it would be wrong to make a guest go home in such a snowstorm." There was a lamp on the wooden table, its warm light illuminating the dark room through the snow patterns. The man, sitting at the table with his arms crossed, silently looked ahead. In front of him stood a bright lit lamp. At this time the atmosphere was strange. Something was disturbing the peace. What happened here while I was absent from Alteric? The man thought, lost in thought. This man is the same servant, right? It's hard to believe that they are the same person. Touching his chin, he continued to think. I'm surprised. Something was definitely different in the past. Evelyn fell to the pavement, surrounded by bright light. The man crouched down next to her, and the boy thought, "Of course." He looked away, his gaze expressing anxiety and confusion, as if he was searching for an answer. There was a moment of complete silence in the luxurious hall. Then, a dull sound came from somewhere. The woman with long hair, holding her head, said quietly, "Temperature." Her steps were uncertain. The lady with green eyes held her hand to her chest. Her face seemed clouded with worry. The pale girl reached for the bell cord, whispering something barely audible. The frail figure clenched its fist near the swaying cord, as if gathering its courage. The dim hall, entwined with shadows, was silent. The chandeliers reflected a barely noticeable light. The blonde stood with her arms folded across her chest, her eyes looking straight ahead, her expression serious. A beam of light penetrated through the half-open doors, behind which massive dark furniture could be seen. A frail figure in light clothing stood in the doorway, leaning on a cane. She looked tired. The cute girl looked at the guy, remaining in the doorway. The girl pressed herself against the wall, lowered her gaze, and asked, "Why aren't you answering? We need to look." The blonde looked away, her face reflecting slight excitement and an internal struggle. A man stood in front of the portrait of a woman in green curtains, and the blonde approached him slowly, keeping her distance. The dark-haired man stood sideways, his silhouette looking determined and slightly thoughtful. The ink spilled across the table, leaving black spots on the paper. The sound of dripping echoed around. The man lowered his head in confusion, holding his palm on his forehead. He thought anxiously, "Why? Why don't I remember?" The old image came up again in my memories. It was different then. An unconscious Evelyn lay in front of his knees. The guy, bending over to the limp girl, closed his eyes. The young man remembered how he accidentally saw this, looking out from behind a large tree. He was confused when he noticed what was happening. It seemed to him that this should not be so. How did he think? Was this really the look with which one looks at one's master? The girl who had entered the room a few minutes ago looked ahead in confusion. Turning to her, the guy asked, "Why you?" He added, "Here." And there was a tense silence between them. A massive golden chandelier hung from the ceiling. Gillas and Evelyn looked at the portrait in silence. The girl looked away from the portrait, and suddenly the man said, "A beautiful picture." Turning his head towards her, Gillas asked, "Is something wrong?" Evelyn walked away, and he added, "Walking around the mansion at such a time. What an interesting guest, though." There were glasses and a bottle on the tray. "If you've already had a rest, maybe you should go back." Evelyn sat by the window and drank some water. There were books and a kettle in the room. She covered her mouth with her hand, looking out the window, but said nothing. Inside, she was torn apart by thoughts. What is he even doing in this room? I can't just leave him here. Evelyn raised her hand to her head, feeling weak. Her thoughts were confused. She had to call someone. She had no strength. The guy in the black glove gently touched her forehead, and she closed her eyes, feeling the light touch. He carefully checked her condition and said, "You have a fever, lady." Then the man asked, "Why didn't you call the doctor?" She answered calmly, "No need to worry." He added sarcastically, "Are your doctors really that bad? Or not?" Oscar Cole remarked with a slight grin. "Did I interrupt your secret meeting?" Evelyn stood up abruptly from her chair, her gaze directed at the guy standing opposite her. She looked stunned, taken aback by the unexpected remark. Abruptly cutting off the conversation, she asked, "Shut up and don't say anything." The guy answered with a smile. "It seemed to me that you were looking for him." Adjusting her hair, the woman said coldly, "You imagined it?" The man said briefly, "I see." After that, he added, "It seems you don't particularly like using servants." Evelyn sat in a chair, and the man held out a glass, offering, "Then, can I help you with anything? Drink some water." The girl raised the glass to her mouth and took a sip. The guy watched her with unexpected surprise. He suddenly said, "Ilua, 20 years of aging. Do you drink such strong alcohol?" Evelyn looked down thoughtfully and said, "One bottle like that costs as much as a carriage." The man poured the drink into an elegant glass, calmly adding, "I have no doubt. I think I'll treat myself to it." The hands of the man and woman touched glasses in a light gesture, and a clink was heard. The girl sat on the chair, looking at the man with the glass in surprise. He suggested, "Let's drink." A woman with long blonde hair sat by the window, her gaze fixed on her interlocutor. The man stood by the window with a glass in his hand, his gaze deep and full of thought. Evelyn sat, her thoughtful gaze directed towards the window. The man raised his gold-rimmed glass closer to his lips. However, noticing the poor condition of the girl opposite, he looked at Evelyn with concern. Clutching her head, she tried to bring herself to her senses. Evelyn thought, feeling embarrassed, "What am I thinking? I have a fever. That's why I'm out of my mind." The girl took a sip of water from her glass. Her eyes widened in sudden surprise. Evelyn reached for the glass. She needed a drink of cold water to calm herself down a bit, but, coughing, she dropped the glass on the floor, causing all its contents to spill. Noticing this, the guy turned his gaze in surprise to the girl, who continued to cough. Gillas raised his head and took a step closer. He pressed his lips together. "Lady, you took my glass." Evelyn covered her face with her hand and shook her head. My head was pounding. My throat. It was burning so much. The man poured liquid into a glass. He said, But don't you drink it often? Evelyn bowed her head, and the man in black gloves supported her chin. The girl lowered her face to the glass. He said, "You, as always, make me worry." The guy raised the glass to Evelyn's lips. She took a few sips with barely noticeable trepidation. Gillas looked down, his voice calm. "That should help a little." Evelyn's eyes narrowed slightly, her cheeks flushed, her breathing quiet and ragged. Gillas looked down at the girl. "Mistress," he said quietly, barely containing his emotions. Evelyn's hand gently touched Gillas's neck. He froze, listening to her touch. Gillas froze as Evelyn gently touched his face with her hand. He froze as Evelyn gently touched his face with her hand. Gillas held the girl tightly by the shoulders. His voice sounded stern. He said, "You are clearly out of your mind." After which, Evelyn leaned against the guy. Her breathing became more even. He silently watched the sleeping girl with surprise. Evelyn seemed completely relaxed in his arms. After which, Gillas transferred Evelyn to the room with the fireplace, which illuminated the entire room. Evelyn slept on the soft sofa, covered with a dark blanket, warmed by the fireplace. Meanwhile, the guy watched the sleeping girl, remaining motionless. The man stood, his gaze directed towards the door. He slightly opened the massive door, leading from the room to the corridor. His gaze lingered, as if something had stopped him. The woman's quiet silhouette was illuminated by a dim light. He thought, silently looking ahead. Suddenly, a thin female hand touched him and pulled him towards itself. The man turned around in confusion and noticed Evelyn there, after which she rose up, looked after the man who was leaving, and reached out after him. Her pale face expressed fatigue. She whispered, "I am very cold." Gillas lowered his head, avoiding his gaze. Evelyn called him softly, "Gil." The doors creaked, revealing a bright opening and filling the dark hall with a cold glow, after which the girl fell asleep. The shot broke the winter silence, leaving an echo in the air. A blonde girl stood in a winter forest with a gun. In front of her was the carcass of a red fox. She picked up the fox's carcass and thought, a red fox. Maybe she could make a scarf out of it? A light breeze touched her face. She whispered thoughtfully, "Number." The man walked away, his silhouette dissolving in the light. The thought hovered. This fur would suit him better. The girl walked along the snowy road. Her steps were light, accompanied by a melodic chant. She stopped and turned, her gaze frozen. She was surprised. The man walked away, and snowflakes surrounded his figure. She cried out, "Gil!" The girl lifted the animal's carcass above her. "Look what I've got! I managed to catch it on the first try." The girl's green eyes shone with thoughtfulness. Her voice sounded soft. "Is that it?" In her hands was a severed head. She was clutching its hair tightly. The light figure in furs staggered and fell onto the snow. A frightened cry was heard. The woman sat trembling with a confused look. The voice asked, "Are you satisfied?" The severed head whispered, "Devilish. I didn't mean to bring you. Dirty mongrel. We died because of you. You destroyed our family." Evelyn looked around in horror, clasping her hands. She cried out, "No, I didn't do it. The blond man extended his gloved hand. She touched it cautiously, hesitating. The blond man held out his hand carefully. He said, "Poor thing." Evelyn, looking up excitedly, said quietly, "Rowan!" Tears glistened in her eyes. The man in the suit lowered his head, his voice sounding soothing. "Don't worry about anything anymore." Rowan picked Evelyn up in the winter forest. He said, "I will protect you." The girl turned around to face Rowan. She let out a quiet cry. Rowan held Evelyn in his arms in the winter forest. She whispered, "Gil." Gillas stood alone in the light, looking into the distance, for a moment. He continued walking across the glowing field, his figure moving away, dissolving into the light. Rowan carried Evelyn across the blood-stained ground, his steps heavy but sure. However, Gil's phantom figure continued to move away from the other person's field of vision. Watching the guy walk away, the girl shouted one last time, "Gil!" After which, Evelyn opened her eyes. She was lying on her side, touching her face with her hand. She couldn't understand what was happening, when suddenly someone asked, "Are you awake?" The colonel was reading a book, and the Duchess was sleeping on his lap the whole time. The guy said, "It looks like you were having a nightmare." Gil held the book in his hands, his expression still thoughtful. The white-haired girl looked puzzled. and somewhat worried as she watched him. Evelyn looked at the man. She stood up and whispered, "I didn't talk in my sleep." The guy put the book on the floor and answered calmly, "No, not at all." The man carefully applied a wet towel to the girl's hot forehead, observing her condition. "But in any case, the temperature became lower when you slept. Rest." Lying, Evelyn opened her eyes, barely audibly saying, "Outside! Servants!" Her voice was barely audible. The guy answered calmly, "Don't worry about it. I'll leave unnoticed. No one will see anything." The woman with green eyes lay on her side, her face looking calm. Gil said, "Go to sleep." The woman lay with her eyes closed, her head slightly turned. Silence enveloped her. The man in the white shirt looked down. She thought, "Gil no, Colonel Black." The chandelier sparkled under the ceiling. She was thinking, "What are you thinking about now? You were always so caring." Or this is one of the ways to attack your opponent. After which, Evelyn lay with a bandage on her head. Or maybe I'm just drunk. Funny, it was just a sip. She lay with her eyes closed. And at that moment, I, helpless, lay on the lap of my enemy. Evelyn lay next to Gillas on the couch. Why, I feel so calm. The sun's rays illuminated the horizon. There were a few fluffy clouds in the sky, creating a warm picture, view of the castle in the morning light. The silence of the morning was filled with calm and soft light of the sun. A man in a cloak and hat stood at the door with a weapon in his hands. The servant said, "The carriage? No need." The man with bright eyes raised his head to the sun. He said, "I'll take a walk, it's good for me." A dark figure in a long cloak was walking along the snow-covered road outside. The snow was falling softly. Evelyn lay on the bed, her hair swaying slightly. The room was silent. The girl rose with difficulty. Her room was flooded with pleasant morning sunlight. Evelyn clutched her head. She looked confused and slightly weakened. The sun's rays penetrated the room. The girl looked out the window, her hair shining in the golden light. She walked barefoot across the sunlit floor, her dress softly touching the tiles. Approaching the window, her fingers lightly touched the frame, and her gaze was thoughtfully directed into the distance. Her eyes reflected the light. Green sparks glistened, and her thin hair fell over her face. A man in a formal suit walked along a snowy street. His gaze reflected determination, his hand clenched into a fist with tension. The snow continued to fall softly to the ground. Evelyn looked at the man. Her face was confused. "I didn't talk in my sleep." Gillas stared ahead. Number not at all. His face held an expression of cold determination. She clutched the fabric of the garment in her hand, as if trying to hold on to the moment. Then the girl looked up. She said, "It's cold, Gil." The young woman sat on the sofa and looked at the man. He said, "Don't get up." The boy bowed his head to her. He said, "I'll call someone." Walking slowly barefoot on the floor, the blonde quietly exhaled. "Wait." Gillas looked at him with concern in his eyes. His gaze expressed tension and surprise. She hugged him, pressing herself against him. Their gaze and breath met in silence. She reached out with her lips to his. The girl approached him, looking straight into his eyes. Through her lips she whispered, "Close the door." His hand adjusted the scarlet scarf, holding it carefully at the base of the cape. Colonel Black pulled his scarf up to his neck, clenching his teeth. His eyes expressed determination and inner anger. A snowy wind swirled in front of the majestic mansion. The day had arrived. Colonel Black's ball. Perhaps the influence of the Archduke. The scale of the event is not comparable to ordinary balls. The man in the dark suit turned to the lady standing next to him. He said, "Look, it's Baron Theodore. I heard he has a lot of debts from gambling, so he owes everyone. It looks pathetic. But the idea that nobles are people with privileges is a thing of the past. The ability to earn money is the main thing." The woman in the green dress covered herself with a fan. She said, "Oh my God, look, it's him." The master of the day stood in the doorway with his arms crossed. The guy smiled, looking at the one who came up. He said, "And you exceeded my expectations, Colonel. I didn't even realize you were so well prepared. Maybe it's a little too much." Then he added, "It's okay. You shouldn't stand in the shadows all the time. It's time to come out and show whose face shines brightest here." The man with the red hair turned around, smiling. "For example, look over there. They're all talking about you." The three women sat at the table, exchanging glances. What was it like? What was it like to steal the hearts of all women? He looked at her with a serious expression, his amber eyes shining. The colonel was silent. Gillas went down the stairs with his interlocutor. He said, "Your Highness, Hans." He stopped and looked forward thoughtfully. His appearance was majestic and unapproachable. A dark figure approached the window, standing out against the bright light. He said nothing, the servant reminded. "Madam, the time indicated in the invitation is about to arrive." The blonde looked at the dresses on the hanger. "It's time for you to go. You should hurry up with choosing a dress." She was silent, her fingers on her dress. Tension hung in the air. She sighed heavily. "I don't like anything. It can't be. These are all expensive dresses from the most prestigious store. Peridot is an expensive gemstone. That's not what I mean. Wilson, bring me a dress from my closet." "Which one?" The woman humbly closed her eyes and calmly answered the servant, so that there would be no confusion. Her green eyes pictured the beautiful, patterned cabinet standing in the other room. There is only one set. In the foreground, the doors of the wardrobe with patterns were visible. The carriage wheel creaked, creating a loud sound. There was a man standing next to the carriage. He said, "Finally, they arrived." The man suggested, "Let's meet them together, Colonel." The guy stood there, looking thoughtfully to the side. He added, "I've prepared a gift." Sonia stepped onto the wooden podium in front of the palace. To the most noble woman of Altric, Gillas stood with a serious expression on his face. His eyes sparkled, reflecting the inner tension. The girl stood in the center of attention, her exquisite dress emphasizing the sophistication of her image. She stood in front of the carriage in a luxurious dress. Lady Perez had arrived. "Greetings, His Highness the Archduke. I wish you prosperity." The Archduke's relative, Sonia Perez. "Sonia, no need to be so formal. You're like a little sister to me. Colonel, would you mind escorting the lady?" Such beauty could not be found even if you searched the entire continent. However, the man remained silent to this remark. Sonia looked up at the thoughtful man with admiration. Her face expressed interest. He stood in front of the girl, looking her straight in the eyes. He said, "It's a great honor to meet you." The man added, "I am Gillas Black, in the service of His Highness the Archduke." She looked away, slightly confused, and replied, "Yes, I've heard a lot about you, Colonel Black." He bowed his head, trying to express modesty. He said, "Although I am not quite suitable for this role, but—" The girl looked at the offered hand. "Could you do me the honor of accompanying you?" She froze, her face flushed with excitement, her eyes radiating confusion and anticipation. Sonia hesitantly extended her hand, her fingers shaking slightly as she brought her palm closer to the other. The carriage wheel stopped abruptly. The last guest had arrived. A gold-framed carriage stopped near a pair of aristocrats, after which they announced, "The last guest, the landowner Winter." Hearing this, the girl turned around. Gillas's amber gaze, directed at the stranger's carriage, suddenly turned cold. The girl stepped heavily onto the wooden stand and climbed out of the carriage. Sonia Perez's gaze expressed confusion and incomprehension due to the alien appearance. The red-haired guy chuckled. She was mistaken and came to the wrong monastery. Partially hiding her face under a mourning veil, a girl approached the aristocrats. Lady Evelyn Winter. Her image expressed mourning, composure, and carefree pride, spreading to all those present. "I definitely received an invitation. Or do you think that the owner of the Winter Mansion became a nun?" People were whispering. She appeared in mourning clothes. "Is she sane?" "I came after receiving an invitation from His Highness. I'm sorry if I'm an unwanted guest here." However, the girl was convinced. "Don't think that you are not welcome here." The guy looked straight into Evelyn's green eyes with intensity. She said, "In that case." And she extended an elegant palm, covered with a black silk glove, after which she came closer. "May I ask the host of the evening to accompany me?" The red-haired man, who had been watching this whole time, chuckled. The girl's eyes were frozen in confusion. She was genuinely confused by someone else's actions. Gillas's amber, cold eyes stared impenetrably at the stranger's face, and Evelyn, raising her emerald gaze, expressed a sincere desire in her request. After some hesitation, the guy finally took the stranger's hand into his own, and, pulling her closer, he kissed her gallantly. "It's an honor for me." Leaving behind Sonia and the red-haired youth, the couple walked on. Then, let's go. The girl turned around in confusion to watch the departing couple. As she watched Evelyn's silhouette recede, she thought, this woman is like… Her hands nervously tugged at the hem of her dress. Which? The richly furnished hall was decorated with a beautiful wall chandelier, illuminating everything around. Evelyn and Gillas entered the hall holding hands. The last guest. The girl held the stick as she walked further into the hall. Lady Winter enters. How could she even have the courage to show up here? Besides, she's dressed in mourning clothes. People continued to whisper, watching the girl. She must be crazy. Even though Evelyn heard all these discussions, she only meekly closed her eyes and chuckled. Thank you for agreeing to walk me home. It seems that, thanks to you, everyone is jealous of me, the girl asked. How do you feel about being the main character of this ball? However, the guy only remained coldly silent, thoughtfully watching the stranger's graceful profile. From somewhere came the sound. The ball will begin very soon. And Gillas closed his eyes. Well, he spoke. It was time to open the curtain, and the first notes sounded in the luxurious hall. Perez County, this family has a short and simple history. The daughter of a count's family, who worked as a courtmaid, spent the night with the king. She gave birth to Victor. Count Perez's prestige and influence seemed to be growing rapidly, but the concubine died in an accident, so now the Perez family's situation has become unstable. The blinding rays of the midday sun poured through the large glass window. Don't worry, Sonia. A young red-haired guy poured a drink. This world is changing. You can't get anywhere with a reputation like that. We should take practicality into account. Such reliable things as trade, he continued, pouring out almost the entire contents of the jug. Weapons and army. Having stuffed a whole bunch of grapes into his mouth, reddish juice flowed down his hand. Strength. The juice flowed down the white patterned tiles. This will help control any area. Something like a solid barrier. The tense figure of the dark-haired man with the broken amber gaze stared into the void. Then, with sparkling pinkish irises, the girl looked at Gillas. He asked, Is everything okay? She hesitated. The guy gallantly extended his hand to her. If you feel uncomfortable, I don't insist. Hearing this, Sonia finally put her neat white glove into someone else's black one. She quickly justified herself. No, I just thought for a moment. A smile lit up her face. I'm glad you asked me to dance first. Colonel Black. There was a murmur in the crowd. Look, Lady Perez is dancing with Colonel Black. They look very handsome together. I think the rumors that Count Perez has his sights set on such a son-in-law are true. A peachy blush appeared on her cheeks, and her eyes sparkled. Music began to play in the hall. This big and strong hand. It feels like it will never let go, no matter what danger threatens, the girl continued to think. His unknown origin, though, is a disadvantage. But it doesn't matter much now. On the other hand, the once great Duchy of Winter was treated so coldly here. I can't believe it. Swirling her champagne in a glass, Evelyn thought regretfully. Boring. They dance quite well. The ball will go well if you manage not to disgrace yourself while dancing. Gillas watched his dance partner coolly, a few strands of hair falling across his concentrated face. Finally, raising the glass of alcoholic drink to her mouth, the girl took a sip. An old image of Gillas appeared in her memories. Do you want to dance with me? It's not wise, mistress. There's only a week left until the ball. I have very little time. That's because you've been playing hooky. The girl impatiently extended her hand to the worried guy. She said, just shut up and follow me. Smiling stupidly, the guy with an amber and mischievous look glanced at the stranger's hand. When dancing, you should be careful not to step on another person's foot. Make sure the movements are smooth. The guy carefully held Sonia by both hands. And the eyes always. Look at the partner. Evelyn continued to drink her champagne, looking at the couple. A memory came to her of learning to dance with a guy. Like being in love. Carefully leaning on someone else's shoulder, Sonia arched her back beautifully. Her hand lay in Gillas's. However, despite the pleasant dance, the guy's gaze directed at Evelyn seemed clouded. Noticing this, the girl pulled the glass closer in surprise and stared at Gillas. Suddenly, from around the corner, someone called out to her, Lady! And she turned her gaze to the source of the sound. A red-haired guy in a beige suit came around the corner. He stopped, holding his hands behind his back. "2 waltzes have already been played, and you haven't even stood up. What a waste of time. Didn't anyone ask you to dance?" "I'm not the right person for such entertainment," the crowd whispered. "Even if you were a widow, it would be wasteful not to show such beauty to anyone. As a consolation, I invite you to dance." The girl turned her calm gaze to the guy. "You have already consoled me enough." Hearing this, he asked with concern, "What was that sad tone?" And he extended his hand, covered with a white glove, to the girl sitting on a small chair. She didn't get up, and the redhead came closer. "It's just beginning." Continuing to dance with the guy, Sonia accidentally stepped on his foot. The girl, having changed her grip, fell onto someone else's chest and cried out, "Oh, God." She blushed embarrassedly and walked away. "Sorry, I'm a bit clumsy." However, Gillas, showing no interest in the words of others, looked in the other direction. "Colonel," leading Evelyn by the hand, the red-haired youth moved closer to the center of the hall. His gaze expressed joy, while the girl seemed exhausted by this. The crowd continued to whisper, "Look, the real composition is about to begin." Looking in the same direction the guy was looking, Sonia stared at the couple in surprise. And then, with the same surprise, she stared at the impartial guy in front of her. He, having completely lost interest in the girl, continued to sparkle with his gaze in the direction of the new couple. Evelyn, holding the red-haired man's hand, danced slowly to the music flowing in the hall. A luxurious chandelier illuminated the entire room. Combined with the facades, it looked mesmerizing. Dozens of beautiful couples waltzed across the marble tiles, intoxicated by the beautiful music. The girl suddenly heard the address again and looked up at the guy. "Lady," the guy asked again. "My help? Have you forgotten about the gift you gave me?" The beaten man looked down. Evelyn said, "Because of this, my secretary suffered greatly." The guy shrugged. "Excuse me, lady, but I don't know what you're talking about." However, the redhead quickly grabbed her from behind. "Why don't you focus on something else?" He pulled her closer. "For example, on this exciting dance with me." Evelyn asked again, surprised. "You don't understand. The attack on Isaac and the theft of the plans." Evelyn's eyes were gleaming green. She was hiding her emotions, lost in her thoughts. Sonia led the dance gracefully. She said, "You dance well, Colonel Black." She continued, looking down. "Have you by any chance taken dance lessons before?" The girl looked up in embarrassment. She watched what was happening with slight confusion. Gillas turned, slightly surprised. He replied, "I'm sorry. The music was loud. I didn't hear you." He started. "You can repeat." As he collided with another pair of dancers in the hall, the girl stepped aside. "Sorry about that. There's so much beauty around, that's why I made a mistake." The red-haired gentleman confidently led his partner, looking to the side. Evelyn remained aside. The pink-haired girl looked to the side, clinging to her partner. A quiet melody sounded in the hall. The high heel slid across the floor, making a soft sound. The dress flew up in a chaotic rush. The man abruptly pushed the dancer away. She screamed. Her dress flew smoothly in motion. The tired girl swayed and looked down. She said, "Sorry, my legs can't hold me up anymore." After these words, she pressed herself against the man. "I need to rest. Could you walk me?" The man with bright eyes looked intently at his companion, his face expressing concentration. The blond man stood to the side and smiled, watching the couple in the distance. Sonia became worried. The red-haired gentleman twirled the girl smoothly. He said, "Don't they look good together?" The interlocutor thoughtfully looked away and said, "By the way." The lady in black lace stood gracefully. Her partner said, "You're holding up well, lady." The lady answered him confidently, "I think you have more to worry about Lady Perez than me." The red-haired gentleman narrowed his eyes mockingly and exhaled, making a quiet sound. Then the guy in white gloves carefully touched the lady. He said, "Lady." The fiery red-haired gentleman approached his interlocutor. He said softly, "Maybe we'll make peace." He asked confidently, "Don't you feel sorry to lose such connections?" The white glove lightly touched the black hand. The slight movement emphasized the tension. Evelyn lowered her hands and bowed to signify the end of the dance. She spoke. The waltz ended. She looked at the hall with an exquisite look. She said, "It's time for me to give up my seat to the other ladies." The young man leaned toward his interlocutor with a smile. He said, "I'd like to twirl you round in a couple more dances." However, ignoring him, Evelyn proudly walked out of the dance hall. The red-haired interlocutor nodded with a slight smile. He said, "Well, so be it." A snowy evening enveloped the facade of the ancient building. The wind swept through the night, rustling in the windows. A lady in a black dress sat on a bench, holding a cane. Her gaze was directed into emptiness. Evelyn lowered her head, her eyes becoming clouded. The wind whispered, raising snowflakes. "I thought he was using the theft of the plans as an excuse to make a deal with me, but he just ignored it. It was to embarrass me. I guess they wanted to make me look like a laughingstock during the dance." The woman's face was covered with a veil of sadness. A tear glistened in her eyes. She felt humiliated. A dark figure sat on a chair. The girl cursed. "Damn body!" The girl in the black dress with emerald eyes looked up, her face expressing a mixture of anxiety and pride. A majestic chandelier illuminated the hall. Warm light fell on the walls, creating a cozy mood. The man examined the girl in the room with the drapes. Everything seemed to be fine, no stretch marks. "I didn't pay attention to it when I looked at him during the dance, but—" The man in the black suit leaned towards the girl. He asked, "Maybe it would be better to call a doctor." A man in a black suit stood in the shadows. The woman thought, a body like a steel wall. Honest and loyal. The young lady looked away, blushing slightly. She thought, if. The dark-haired gentleman sat looking at her leg. She thought, if only he were mine. "Still, we should call a doctor." The confused young lady shook her head. She said, "No need, Colonel Black." The girl stood up abruptly and broke the silence. She said, "Stop." After which, Sonia took a step, but her awkwardness made her slip. The man looked thoughtfully. She fell awkwardly into the arms of a stranger, who caught her just in time. The snow-white walls of the mansion reflected the moonlight. The wind carried snowflakes across the sky. The sound broke the silence. The man asked, "Why are you sitting alone in such a place? Were you also kicked out?" Hearing a strange voice, Evelyn turned around in confusion. "You!" His face was covered in scarlet abrasions. "I need your help, lady." "Okay." The large chandelier in the palace hall shone, illuminating the room with a soft light. Evelyn hugged the man, pressing herself against his chest. She whispered, "Please, can I stay like this?" Then the lady raised her head, her face flushed. She said, "I'm just really nervous." The girl continued, "I feel calm when I'm in your arms. It's strange, isn't it?" The man looked at Evelyn with embarrassment and replied, "This tie, it suits you very well." Evelyn looked down and asked, touching his clothes, "Did you receive a gift?" The young man stood next to Evelyn. A sudden sound made him turn around. He was surprised. Evelyn peered carefully over his broad shoulder and asked, "Who's there?" The man immediately turned around, his gaze focused and attentive. The sky was covered with clouds. A strong wind raised snowflakes, creating an oppressive atmosphere. A woman in a morning dress sat in a chair, her gaze troubled. She said, "You!" Baron Theodore bowed to the woman. She asked, "Is it really Baron Theodore?" He answered, "Yes, it is I, lady. Look at them. No matter how amazing a person looks, his character is not always noble." The Baron, looking through the window, added with contempt and disgust, "They are so like pigs." The woman sat looking ahead, her face expressing mixed feelings, anxiety and fatigue. The girl warned, "Even the walls have ears. I would advise you to refrain from thoughtless words." The Baron raised his voice in irritation and added, "Aren't you angry, lady? Look at the situation." The lady stood looking at the Baron. "You came to the banquet in morning clothes. Did you want to become a laughingstock?" The Baron spoke expressively. "All they do is talk behind your back." The woman looked at him with a cold, determined expression, her green eyes shining in the semi-darkness. The Baron stood in front of her and said irritably, "You're drunk. Go back." The blonde spoke indignantly. "Go back? Do you want to let them laugh? We are nobles." The woman sighed wearily, leaning against the chair, and said, "If you're not going to leave, I'll leave." The blonde grabbed her hand tightly, not allowing her to leave, and said insistently, "Wait." Baron Theodore approached Evelyn, trying to persuade her. "Listen, I have a business plan. The blow to Theodore's cheek silenced him, a red mark immediately appearing on his skin. Evelyn said that everyone knew about Theodore's gambling and his weakness for such expenses. Theodore gritted his teeth, driving Evelyn away. Don't disgrace the nobles. Go away. Your proposals are of no interest to me. The lady was surprised when Theodore suddenly grabbed her hand, his eyes full of determination. The Baron snatched the hat from the young girl. She was perplexed and opened her eyes wide. Theodore clutched Evelyn's hat in his hands and said defiantly, "Do you think this doesn't concern you?" The girl looked at Theodore, demanding to let her go. She said, "Let go!" The blonde held her hand tightly. Gillas spoke with a tense face. He asked, "Didn't you come here to find a rich man?" The lady in the black hat looked away, blushing. She remained silent, trying to hide her emotions. Evelyn kicked the man hard in the groin, creating a sharp sound. The tension was building. She stood in front of the bowed Gillas in a black dress. She said, "You're talking nonsense." Gillas grabbed Evelyn's braid sharply, yanking it back. She froze, the tension in the air. Evelyn fell to the ground in front of Gillas, who stood over her. He let out a quiet breath, clenching his fists. The girl sat on the floor, looking at Gillas with an angry look. She said, "Damn, woman!" Gillas stood before Evelyn, who had risen to her feet. "Don't look down on me. Don't think our situations are different." A bright chandelier illuminated the room, filling it with a sense of luxury and cold isolation. A gloved hand grabbed the handle of the massive door, as if intending to open it. There were two servants standing in the corridor. One of them, kneeling down, looked fearfully at the man who had entered. The servants hurried out of the room, apologizing. Another added, "It seems we have the wrong room." Black stood with a serious expression on his face, showing no emotion and looking straight ahead. A girl with lilac hair approached Gillas. She asked, "Colonel Black, has something happened?" Looking at the girl, he, still holding the door, said, "You need to rest, Lady Perrys. I'll get you a drink." The soft light of the chandelier filled the spacious hall, creating an atmosphere of calm. Walking through the hall, Gillas found himself surrounded by people. The atmosphere was noisy, and the music sounded distant. He stopped in the middle of the crowd, his gaze fixed ahead, his expression cold. Moving into another room, the man walked forward with a determined look. The music played quietly. Suddenly, a white-gloved hand grabbed Evelyn's wrist. She looked at Gillas tensely. Evelyn found herself pinned to the floor by my lord, who asked, "Why don't you scream?" "Because you understand, right?" "Shut up, I don't need anyone's help. People like you are no problem for me," she said. With a snow-white smile, the man with white hair answered, "We had a great chance to spend time without strangers." Evelyn looked at the man defiantly. She asked, "Are these your hidden preferences?" On a dark terrace, a man sat next to a girl. He suggested, "Then just relax and enjoy." Gillas looked slightly confused as he rose above the girl. He said, "What?" Evelyn looked up from below, surprised, and with a confused look directed straight at him. A man in a dark suit appeared in the doorway, illuminated by the light. He saw the scene before him. The black-haired man held a bottle of expensive wine with a firm grip, looking away. In the center of the room stood a massive canopy bed, draped with white curtains. Sitting on the bed, the girl thought. To calm down, it's worth drinking. It's about alcohol, right? And there are two of us here. A sudden sound made Evelyn raise her head. She thought, "By the way, the colonel should already be here." She stood by the window, outside which lights were flashing and petals were scattering. Approaching the glass, the girl froze in the light of the multicolored lights that fell to the floor. Her eyes widened in surprise when she saw the man behind the glass. Without looking back, Gillas confidently walked away into the distance, while Evelyn reached out her hand to the glass. Standing by the window, the girl froze, her face reflecting a mixture of anxiety and hope. In the man's arms was a woman in a dark dress, her face hidden by a hooded cape. I remembered the dark-haired man staring intently, holding a glass and a bottle of wine in his hands. The blonde looked at Evelyn with a smile. He said, "What is the host of the party doing here?" Looking up, the girl replied, "As you can see, we're busy here." "Calm down," the man with the wine added. "I'm tired of dancing, and I didn't mean to stop you from enjoying yourself." She looked down and said quietly, "But aren't you cold here? Maybe you should go to the guest room?" Confusion was evident on her face. The girl looked away in another direction. In front of the dark-haired man sitting on the throne, there was a girl and a blonde man. They asked, "What is the point of hospitality?" The man said in a calm voice, "I am the owner of this estate, and I wanted to go out onto the balcony and breathe." Evelyn stood in front of him, her silhouette illuminated by a soft light, and Gillas stood behind him. The blonde said in surprise, "Enjoying it?" And she opened her green eyes wide. With his glass raised, the man calmly replied, "I think you're the ones having fun here." The girl looked away with a smirk and said quietly, "It's true." Her hand grabbed the blonde's collar tightly, pulling him towards her. As they approached, the blonde couple looked slightly embarrassed, her hair flying and their eyes meeting. Evelyn tried to kiss, but they both kept their eyes open, embarrassed. Sitting on the throne, the black-haired man was still drinking wine from a glass, carefully watching what was happening. While kissing the fair-haired man, Evelyn glanced sideways at the one sitting on the throne. Making eye contact, he let out a strained laugh and continued drinking. At one point, the girl was a couple of meters away from Gillas, saying that the kiss sucked. Wiping her lips, the girl said that with such skills, it was impossible to become a lover of noble ladies. She added with a slight sneer, "Although it is trivial, I hope it was enough in exchange for our little game." Gillas screamed indignantly, "Damn, girl, did you use me like a guy of easy virtue?" He grabbed the neck of the wine bottle the black-haired man was drinking. "How dare you!" The bottle immediately flew straight at Evelyn, breaking into small pieces and scattering them around. His cry was loud, "I won't let this go!" A long-fingered hand suddenly wrapped around Gillas's neck, silencing him. Squeezing the blonde's throat, the black-haired man stared at him with his bright red eyes. Gillas tried to say in a strangled voice, "Colonel!" He gently touched the hand squeezing his neck. Watching what was happening, Evelyn adjusted her clothes, stepped aside, and cleared her throat. The man lifted the boy by the neck, lifting his feet off the ground. He said coldly, "Sorry." Evelyn turned to Black. "Do you really want to ruin the evening with your own hands?" She watched every move carefully and added, "Don't forget, you're the boss here." As if realizing something, the man abruptly let go of Gillas, who fell to his knees, trying to cough. In a panic, the blonde rushed to the balcony, muttering, "We have to run!" On the balcony, the black-haired man stood calmly, watching the blonde man attempt to climb over the railing. He looked into the distance with slight indifference. The man had fallen. A smooth voice of a girl with golden hair came from behind. "Call a doctor." Only the dark-haired man and Evelyn remained on the balcony. She commented, "What a mess." Turning away, he said confidently, "I agree." A view of a majestic building opened up before them. She reminded them, "You need to go back and clean up this mess." A tall man in a formal suit stepped forward. "So, why were you looking for me?" Evelyn asked. He bowed his head slightly and replied, "Lady Winter." Looking down, the girl said quietly, "I'll take care of myself." Her fatigue was noticeable as she sat on the chair, silently looking ahead. The man said in his even voice, standing with his back to her, "That's why you left." She lowered her head, her hair touching her shoulders. There was silence in the air. Evelyn remained in the chair as voices were heard outside the door. "Black, come here!" Hiding her face under the hood of a black cloak, she remained silent as snowflakes swirled around her. Black dropped to one knee in front of her, looking closely into her eyes. "Lady!" Holding the emblem in his hand, he looked at it carefully. He said quietly, "Hurry up." Her wary gaze and the tears on her face betrayed the tension of the moment. There was a girl sitting on the chair, and Black, bending over in front of her, asked, "Colonel, what now?" The man came closer, and a slight tension froze in his eyes. He lifted the girl into his arms, holding her tightly by the waist, and the light fabric of the dress fluttered. He carried her in his arms with confident steps, while a scream was heard in the distance. "Black, urgently." The girl looked away and said quietly, "Why do I always do things I regret later?" He pulled her close and, holding back his emotions, said, "Enough." The facade of the majestic building was illuminated with lights, and the wind swayed the trees. A man and a servant stood near the carriage. Black gave a short order, "Drive out through the back gate." Sitting inside the carriage, the girl said, "You are too kind. If the Archduke finds out, he will be furious," he answered, staying close. It doesn't matter, Evelyn said with a hint of weariness. It was the worst ball of my life. Outside the carriage, a man quietly added, "For me too." Fireworks exploded over the palace, lighting up the sky with bright colors. The silhouette of a black-haired man gradually dissolved in the light of the fireworks, moving away from the carriage. Standing at a distance, he continued to look at the lights that illuminated his thoughtful face. Evelyn sat in the carriage, her head bowed, and light came through the windows, illuminating her hood. Her green eyes looked into the distance, expressing sadness and doubt. Bright golden sparks of fireworks flashed across the sky, illuminating the quiet night. Afterwards, the guests enjoyed the atmosphere of some kind of ball. They were surrounded by music, and fireworks were heard behind the glass. Meanwhile, a rumble was heard in the streets. A tall man stood opposite the garden and watched everything that was happening. Then the young man lowered his head, lost in thought. He was clearly considering the situation. A girl sat down on a bench nearby, covering her face with her hands. Her cloak lay on the ground nearby, and her cane stood nearby. At that moment, Black turned away and looked into the distance. A look of realization flashed across his face, and his eyes grew softer. At this time, Evelyn touched her face with her hand, her green eyes looking somewhere to the side. The man walked away, disappearing into the illuminated archway. Behind him, the blinding fireworks continued to explode. Rumor had it that an accident had occurred at the colonel's ball. Baron Theodore lost his balance on the terrace and broke his leg. Meanwhile, a crowd had gathered in the square. How drunk did he have to be? Was he really going to blame Black for this? He was lying on the floor, and many understood that Black was not to blame. He felt responsible for the incident. Evelyn turned around abruptly while sitting at the chess table. Suddenly, a voice called out to her, "Mistress!" The servant entered the room with noticeable excitement. His words rang out clearly. A guest had arrived. At this, Evelyn raised an eyebrow in surprise. She clarified, "A guest?" But there was nothing like that on the schedule. Suddenly, a man entered, and everyone turned to him. He said, "I apologize for my sudden arrival." The tall man took off his hat, smiling affably. He said, "I was passing by and decided to say hello." He leaned forward politely, holding his hat on his chest. The man asked, "May I ask how you are doing, lady?" Then the man who was sitting stood up abruptly and said, "Prince Joshua?" The redhead, stunned, began to approach the newcomer and asked, "Is it really you?" He grabbed his hands with excitement and said, "You have changed so much. How old are you?" He answered, 19. After which the man grabbed his head and screamed, "I don't believe it. 10 years have already passed. Am I really that old?" Evelyn smiled, looking at the men. She said, "Wait, Oscar. Sit down, Your Highness." The room shone with luxury. A large chandelier and green curtains created a festive atmosphere. The chessboard with the pieces set out lay on the table. The man asked, "Did you play chess?" Oscar stood up, stretching his shoulders. He said, "I can't play anymore. Let the prince replace me. Do you mind?" The blond young man looked down, smiling slightly. His eyes shone against the background of the hall. He began to remember how he played chess as a child. He recalled, "Once I took lessons from one person. This was an opponent that took your breath away." It was impossible to predict what he was thinking. Evelyn looked down, frowning slightly. She said, "The one you're talking about." The white-haired youth spoke, slightly bowing his head. He said, "I saw no hope of victory." A woman's hand in a black glove gently touched the shoulder of a man in a vest. "Because he never." The golden-haired woman put her arm around the man's shoulders. She said, "Never parted with his goddess of victory." The woman leaned toward the man. She said, "The game should have been over long ago." The boy sat at the table. He said, "However, I didn't expect anything else from you." Surprise was reflected in the eyes of the boy with white hair. He shuddered. "What do you think, Your Highness?" The girl with golden hair hugged the man. She said, "What will you do next?" "I don't remember how long I've been training since then." "Do you like playing chess?" Evelyn asked. The fair-haired young man with blue eyes looked slightly thoughtful. He was silent. He said confidently, sitting opposite the girl, "I like playing with you." The stained glass window cast rays of light. The crystal chandelier shimmered in its reflection. Meanwhile, the purple-haired girl in the dress stood up at the table. She said, "So, what happened?" The man stood by the window. "I have to leave soon on business," the girl asked. "Is Colonel Black in love with someone?" The red-haired man looked surprised. He replied, "What are you talking about? This can't be." The lady looked down. He added, "Don't worry, no one can resist you in love affairs." The girl was embarrassed and blushed from the elder's words. Beads of sweat ran down her cheeks. She remembered seeing the colonel with a girl in his arms. "I saw the colonel come out with a woman in his arms. Rumor has it that they were together on that terrace." The man with red hair stood thoughtfully by the window. Said, "By any chance, not Lady Winter?" "That's right," he recalled. "They say no one saw her carriage leave." The red-haired man covered his lips with his hand, thoughtfully. He exhaled. "The king chess piece fell on the board," the man said. "Checkmate." The white-haired youth looked at the board in surprise, raising his hand. He sighed. At the chess table, men watched the game. It was a loss. "How shameful," she talked us into stories. Evelyn held the book in her hands with a serious expression. She said, "Can I ask a question as a prize?" The white-haired youth leaned towards her and listened attentively, and said, "Yes." Evelyn sat at the chess table, looking up at the young man. She said, "Why did you come alone without servants?" The sun's rays softly illuminated the facade of the majestic building with a dome. The interior hall was decorated with a huge chandelier. It shone brightly, reflecting light from glass pendants. The man put on a white shirt, covering his cut back with cloth. A servant's voice came from behind him. "Colonel, you have a message." He turned and looked at the one who entered. The servant, having given the letter into the man's hands, stepped back and hid his hands behind his back. The dark-haired man began to read. Black quickly got ready and walked towards the door, calling the blonde servant with him. "Let's go." The castle was illuminated by the sun's rays that peeked out from behind the covered clouds. Colonel Black threw on his coat and walked confidently out of the mansion. His servant followed him less confidently. "Where are you rushing off to so early in the morning, Colonel?" A voice came from ahead. Black raised his head and surveyed the area. Black saw a man standing languidly near the carriage, in a closed pose. The red-haired young man smiled, looking forward softly. He said, "Let's have a cup of warm tea." A dark-haired man with yellow eyes stood in front of the palace. He said, "Archduke." On the chessboard, the Black King lay defeated by the white pieces. The white-haired youth folded his arms as he sat at the table. He asked, "Have you ever heard of the Red Hawk Brotherhood? This is the secret society that planned the uprising? But it was ousted long ago." The young man turned away with a sad expression. He answered quietly, "Number It still exists." The officers greeted the colonel. "If you had warned us of your visit, we would have prepared refreshments." The red-haired young man put a friendly arm around his companion's shoulder. He suggested, "Let's go in." He lowered his head and said, "We have something to talk about, and it should be a man-to-man conversation." The man opposite folded his hands in his lap, his voice subdued. "Even in the palace." Evelyn looked up, her face thoughtful. The man continued, "And at the academy." The young man looked confused, his head down. His quiet exhalation was almost inaudible. The man, sitting at the chessboard, said sadly, "No one tells me the truth." Two people were walking across the courtyard towards the mansion. One of them put a friendly arm around the other's shoulder. The sun was setting, its rays reflected on the facade of the building, and illuminated the city. The little girl exclaimed, "It's been a while since we've been to the market." The man smiled, looking at her. "Did you see something interesting, Sherry?" The lady in the red cape looked sternly after them. She said, "We didn't come here to have fun." The man nodded and answered calmly. The girl apologized. "I apologize. Sherry is still a child. Everything is fine." A slight embarrassment crossed the man's face. He said softly, "And you can speak more quietly and informally." Evelyn looked away, listening to her companion. He said, "I would not like to reveal my identity here." They exchanged glances in the morning light. The girl said, "Okay, whatever you say, Joshua." The man carefully took the cup of tea, exhaling loudly. The red-haired man relaxed and said, "The tea is simply excellent." The black-haired man, raising the cup to his lips, said thoughtfully, I got this tea at the ball. The red-haired man smiled slyly, touching his chin with his finger and casting a slightly mocking glance. In the room, the men sat opposite each other. One said slyly, Could it be from Lady Winter? The man thought for a moment and hesitated to answer, his cheeks turning slightly red. He smiled. A joke, just a joke. But I recently heard an interesting story. He continued. Sonia asked me about your relationship with Lady Winter. The red-haired man rested his hand on his face. He said, This woman was alone with Theodore on the day of the ball. He put the cup on the saucer and asked, Something happened and you sent her home? The black-haired man sat in a chair, his arms crossed. There was a cup of tea on the table. The man in black gloves folded his hands together and exhaled. Black looked down. He said, It would be problematic if Lady Winter got into a scandal. The red-haired man looked away thoughtfully, his hand resting on his face. The roofs of city houses were visible on the street. The sun illuminated the tops of the buildings. The seller at the market offered, Would you like to buy some apples? They are good for your skin. Evelyn stood next to the blonde man. The salesman said, Do you see any other cute couples here? The seller held an apple and smiled. This will be a wonderful gift for your companion. Is she your wife already? The man waved his hands and said, No, it's not. Evelyn looked away and turned to him. Joshua. Evelyn looked at her interlocutor with a smile, asking, Is it so difficult for you to give a gift to your sister? The blonde was surprised. Surprise escaped his lips. 3 coins for 10 pieces, said the seller. The couple stood at the counter, discussing. For 12th or we don't buy. The seller was indignant. What stubbornness! They walked with a basket of apples, while Evelyn instructed. You shouldn't react to the merchant's words like that, she said to the man with a cold look. It will eventually come out that you are hiding your identity. The man took off his hat, became embarrassed, and hesitated, not knowing what to say. The man adjusted his hat, his gaze full of tension. Evelyn stood next to the man. He said, I always thought there was nothing you didn't know. The lady replied with a soft smile. Your Highness the Prince is already a wonderful person. The blond man in the top hat smiled slightly, wiping his forehead. He said, No, not enough yet. When we first met, he was about my age. He was wearing a red coat and beige pants. He recalled that this guy was considered a genius who could lead the whole world. He remembered how the young man stood, and the boy looked at him from below. His name was known throughout the continent, the blonde said. I know I can't be like him. Often comparing us makes me feel humiliated. The girl with green eyes and flushed cheeks looked down, lost in her thoughts. A magnificent chandelier under the high glass ceiling reflected the light. What does this mean, Colonel? The red-haired man sat in the chair. He said, Could you be more specific? Black sat with a cup. He said, I mean, if the lady gets involved in a scandal and makes a fuss. He lifted the cup, covering his face with his gloved hand, and said, Then he won't be able to act. The red-haired man leaned on his hand, looking thoughtfully to the side, listening to his interlocutor. He jumped up, hitting the table with force. He said, Rowan's location has become known? Delicate hands carefully held a pale green rose. Someone said, Sorry, Mr. A girl with a basket stood in front of the couple. Buy at least 1 flower. I couldn't sell a single one today. With her head down, she held out a flower from her basket. And she said, Please. The girl's trembling hand extended a pale green rose with sharp thorns from the basket. Evelyn looked towards that little girl with a little excitement. Joshua turned to the girl. A beautiful flower. What is it called? I don't know. I picked them in the mountains. Yes? Then it is a precious flower. I simply have to buy it, the man said with a smile. Evelyn thought about the young man's words and mentally distanced herself from the conversation. Rowan! He really was special, the green-eyed girl said. Joshua turned his head slightly in her direction. Truly gifted with talent, but young Evelyn thought about how to formulate the phrase further. You don't have to become like him, she said, looking at the man and the girl. The hall of the mansion. Light envelops the entire room, and lanterns create a warm atmosphere. There was a report. Black raised the white cup to his face, intending to take a sip. If you search calmly and without haste, he began to reason. Joshua, having bought flowers from the girl, looked at them. Meanwhile, the girl bowed to them. She was about to leave, turning her back to them. She awkwardly fiddled with her fingers and smiled. Evelyn followed the girl with her eyes, thinking about the situation that had happened. The green-eyed girl and the man watched her as she ran into the alley. Running around the corner, a man was waiting for her there. She ran up to him. He placed his hand on the little girl's head approvingly, smiling. Evelyn stood frozen in amazement for a moment, not realizing for a moment what she had seen. Black, taking a sip of liquid from his cup, continued, "You'll definitely find a clue." The young girl, still looking at the little girl with the man, whispered softly, "Rowan!" The light building with a high bell tower shone in the rays of the sun, creating a calm atmosphere. The girl with green eyes looked forward with slight surprise. Someone said, "Lady?" The pale roses in the bouquet appeared in front of the girl's face, her gaze frozen in confusion. The man handed the bouquet to the girl. He said, "Did I scare you? I called you, but you didn't respond." The pale roses in the bouquet reflected the light. He said, "I will be glad if the lady accepts them." Evelyn reached out for the bouquet, her face slightly embarrassed. She said, "Thank you, Prince." The lady pressed the bouquet to her face and closed her eyes. She said, "They smell wonderful." Joshua invited the girl to go for a walk. "There are a lot of people gathered in that direction. Don't you want to see what's there?" The girl leans towards a bouquet of white roses to inhale their scent. Evelyn walked down the street with a bouquet of white roses in her hands, gently pressing it to her chest. The magnificent building stood in the center of the city. Its facade reflected the rays of the setting sun. The man in the coat waved goodbye. He said, "Well, I'll wait for news." He stopped in front of the carriage. The horses stood still. He raised his hand to his head. Colonel Black took a step forward, his movements confident and calm. The man was holding a piece of paper. "There is information that Rowan Winter was seen in the center. He is being tracked down." The blonde looked at the window. He asked, "When will they find him? Eliminate him?" He answered, "No, he is needed alive." The man looked intently ahead. He asked, "And if he resists?" Black glanced at his servant, turning his face to the sun's rays. "I know your skills well," Black said, after which the blonde became a little embarrassed. The gray-haired man narrowed his eyes, looking down. He said, "I see." Then, there was a massive bowl of coals in the corner of the room. I thought the colonel would do something completely different. Hiding his face in the shadows, Black nervously adjusted his tie and lit a cigarette. The man's focused gaze pierced the void. But this time, everything was different. A woman's cold eyes flashed from under a black veil. She said, "Isn't it obvious? What's the fun?" A man with a thoughtful expression held a cigar by the window. He spoke, a little more slowly and painfully. "Vicious. Just the thing for a cunning opponent?" Black remembered the kiss between Gillas and Evelyn. The cigarette in the corner of the man's mouth smoldered, leaving sparks and ash falling. Black remembered how he and Evelyn stood close to each other. The ash from the cigarette suddenly fell off and onto the floor. The man sat in a chair, his posture relaxed. He was silent, expressing slight bewilderment, looking at the fallen ashes. The colonel held a dark pack of cigarettes in his hand and looked at it. In the silence of the room, the man bent over the package. He remained thoughtful. The door began to slowly open. A characteristic creak was heard. The man, leaving the room, stretched, showing slight fatigue. The tower of the ancient cathedral rose against the backdrop of a gentle sunset. Evelyn and the prince were walking down the street. He was holding her shoulders lightly. "An innocent prince walks a thorny path," Oscar said quietly, holding the girl's hand. The girl happily pointed to the sign of the chocolate shop. The man asked, "Do you want some chocolate?" She was already holding the box of chocolates in her hands, with an expression of delight. The man thought, "If you think about it." The man looked into the distance with a thoughtful expression. He thought, Rowan loved chocolate too. There were gift boxes on the table, stacked in a neat row. What did they give you? Two men sat among the gifts. "Teeth rot if you eat everything at once." "I'll go to the residence." The man thought about his actions, holding the object. He said, "I plan to give this to the lady." The child was pulling at some blanket. The man was holding his head. He said, What kind of thoughts are creeping into my head? Oscar looked at her. He said, Sherry, what are you doing? This is someone else's property. The girl in the hat stopped abruptly and looked under the veil. Her face was illuminated by a ray of sunlight. There was a seal-shaped symbol on the marble wall. Someone said, it was a mark from a seal. Evelyn and Oscar were discussing the marks on the walls. They were scattered all over the city, an attempt to gather strength. The green-eyed girl turned her head to the side, illuminated by rays of light. The girl stood on a city street. She looked back at the figure in the distance, watching thoughtfully. The man stood thoughtfully. Evelyn turned to him. Joshua, it's chilly outside. The lady looked at her interlocutor and asked, shouldn't I dress warmer? The man answered slightly embarrassedly, everything is fine. I'm not cold at all. After which the girl turned to Joshua and said calmly and firmly, we are being followed. The young man stood there, lost in thought. Evelyn said, we're attracting attention. We should blend in. Joshua got nervous and looked at the girl and started to panic. But suddenly you are in danger. Suddenly, green-eyed Evelyn abruptly struck the man's back with her cane in irritation. She held her cane with a smile and pretended to miss the prince's words. What you said, I missed. After that, the man looked back. His expression was confused. He rubbed the place where he had been hit. He remained silent. The majestic building with a high glass roof was illuminated by bright rays of the sun. Then Evelyn stopped at the lamppost with a basket of flowers. Her gaze ran anxiously along the street. The woman's eyes widened in surprise at what she saw. However, the man was walking down a narrow alley and holding the girl by the hair. She was crying, covering her face with her hands. Meanwhile, the man looked over his shoulder, his gaze puzzled. He asked Evelyn, what? Meanwhile, the lady stood at a distance and smiled at the man. He asked, do you have some business with me, beauty? After Evelyn thought about it, her gaze became confused. She thought, no, it wasn't him after all. I was just mistaken. But the man smiled. Standing next to Evelyn, she said, there are new faces in our neighborhood. At this time, she touched her hat, lowering her gaze, and said, I was walking and accidentally turned the wrong way. The young man abruptly took the hat off the girl she had touched. Then the man looked at Evelyn with a smile. He said, you are a beauty. Maybe you came here on purpose, after which decided to have some fun? It would be sad to leave here. Don't worry, you won't regret it, she thought. Problem. The man stood in front of Evelyn. What are you doing here? There were other people visible behind. Two unfamiliar men stood next to each other. One of them looked at the other and exclaimed. Evelyn turned her head, her gaze calm. One of the men said, I was looking for you. The man stood behind Evelyn, holding her shoulder. He said, we have to go home, lady. The blonde man held the girl by the shoulders. He said, it's time for us to go home, lady. The man looked sternly at his interlocutors. He said, if you have no business with my lady, then please get out of the way. Evelyn looked at the young man in surprise. She thought, this guy. A tall officer in uniform stood in front of the banner. The girl thought, isn't it? The walking blonde bumped into a group of strangers. One of them said, are you Alphonse or something? Evelyn stopped in front of the man who was accompanying her. He asked, would you mind stepping away for a minute? While the companion was asking Evelyn a question, someone swung a fist at him. The noble girl with the basket of white flowers was amazed to see this and cried out. In that moment, the blonde man knocked down the attacker, and everyone standing around was shocked. A grin appeared on his face, and his hand, wrapped in bloody cloth, rose up. He exhaled. The blonde stood in front of the white-haired man. Evelyn shouted, enough! The girl with the basket in her hands approached the man. She said, stop it, dear. I hate blood. The blonde stood by the man lying on the ground. He said, well, if the lady so wishes. He was calm. A passerby in light clothes approached the lying man. She said, how dare you? The stranger, who also approached the lying man, said, well, well. While the couple was leaving, passers-by were talking among themselves. This is Colonel Black's right hand. The sun gradually emerged from behind the houses, illuminating the roofs and streets. A man with white hair stood next to Evelyn. He said, You have good acting skills. The blonde man noticed that Evelyn didn't like his touch. He said, "Sorry." He looked at the gun pointed at him. The man said, "If this offended you, I apologize." The girl held the gun confidently, aiming it at the man. She asked, "Who sent you?" He raised his hands, trying to explain the situation. The man said, "It's a misunderstanding." She squinted, holding the weapon. The girl asked, "The colonel ordered? Turn around." He obediently turned around in one motion and raised his hands higher without resisting. The blonde looked ahead. He said, "You may not know, but there are many unpleasant things happening in the world. I just couldn't pass by a lady in trouble." The man added. The girl answered, "Civil patrol?" Evelyn held the gun, pointing it at the man's back. The man exhaled. "What?" He turned his head, raising his hands. The man said, "It's a holiday?" "Yeah." The girl stood opposite the blonde man with the gun. He said, "If I had known that they wouldn't even thank me, I wouldn't have helped." Evelyn held the gun confidently, ready to fire. Then she lowered it a little. The green-eyed woman stood in front of the man, holding a gun. She asked, "Your name?" The silver-haired man introduced himself. "Derek Howard. I am a lieutenant in the Altaric Army." Evelyn held the gun in her hand, her gaze calm. She said, "I'll remember." Derek stood watching the handkerchief move in the air and replied, "You'll forget it." Evelyn stood with her cane in the bright sunlight, about to leave, and said, "Dry yourself." Derek Howard bent down to pick up the handkerchief from the ground and muttered, "Thank you." The blonde man picked up the beige scarf from the floor and squatted down. The man began to wipe the scarlet blood off his gloves, after which the man confidently threw away the handkerchief and glove. He looked ahead, his gaze focused. A thin voice was heard from the side. "Mister?" It was the girl in the dress who stood timidly opposite the man. She said, "I did as you said." Silver-haired Derek straightened his tie, looked at her, and replied, "Well done." The girl extended her hand to the man who was giving her a coin. He said, "Your reward." The young man grabbed her hand tightly, stopping her movement. She said, "Thank you." He looked at the child with a cold expression, bringing her closer to him. He said, "As for this matter," the girl held her hands in fear. She said, "I won't tell anyone, I swear." The man extended his hand with the coins to her. He said, "Right, good job." The girl in the green dress walked away quickly, holding her hands in front of her, a little embarrassed. The man stayed behind, watching her and following her around the corner with his eyes. Two redheads were behind the counter in the store. One said, "Welcome." A tall man with dark hair entered the room. The salesman said, "Colonel." Colonel Black looked straight ahead. He said, "To me as usual." The red-haired boy, pointing with his hand, exclaimed loudly, "Yes, it will be ready soon." The seller offered something to the man. "We have something. Would you like to see it?" "Number, I don't need anything else." The child's hand lightly touched the man's coat, as if holding it back. The boy handed the man some candy. He said good-naturedly, "It's from the house." "Candy!" The man looked at the outstretched hand with the candy. He was silent. The colonel stood in front of the counter. Two people apologized. The elder said, "The colonel doesn't want this." "Sorry." Colonel Black took the candy between two fingers and added calmly, "I'll take this." He walked out of the building, raising his hand to his face to light a cigarette. From the store came the sound of, "Come again!" The man raised his gloved hand to his lips, his gaze thoughtful. He exhaled cigarette smoke. The girl grabbed the fabric of the man's coat, her white gloved hands clenching tightly. Black stood on the street, looking thoughtful, holding a bag over his shoulder. The girl with green eyes looked up at the man. She looked surprised and uncertain. She lowered her head. She looked upset and embarrassed. The man with the bag in his hands turned and leaned slightly towards the girl, not understanding what she wanted. Black looked away, his gaze thoughtful. Silence filled the space. The little girl with green eyes looked up. The colonel thought, why was she here? The young man turned back and moved a little away from the girl. The man turned away from Sherry. She looked confused and froze in place. The girl looked worried. She looked around and, clenching her fists, thought. She ran after the man. She held out her hand to stop him, but he didn't pay attention. The green-eyed woman grabbed the edge of the colonel's coat. The fabric stretched slightly in her hands. She fell to the ground, still holding the man's coat. People around her began to whisper. God, the baby was crying so much. The man looked ahead with slight irritation. His gaze was cold. Sherry, sitting at the dining table, looked ahead in surprise. They said, "Sherry Winter, what are you doing here?" The man sat opposite, watching, said, "Suspicious if you didn't know, it's dangerous to walk around without adults." He looked up from his newspaper, turning to Sherry. He said, "Explain your presence using the 6-question principle." The girl listened attentively, her gaze expressing confusion. She sighed. The servant stood next to the man as he gave the order. He said, "Bring the dinner. The child is hungry." Suddenly, a plate with breakfast appeared on the table in front of Sherry. The servant wished her bon appétit. The girl's hands held a knife and fork, and her eyes sparkled with joy at the sight of the food. Suddenly, she noticed something to the side. Her expression became surprised and a little wary. At the large table in the center of the room, Black pulled a plate toward him. He said, "Answer first." The girl threw her hands up and became indignant, waving them in different directions. Sherry Winter looked at her empty plate, embarrassed. The colonel asked her, "You don't talk?" The man at the table looked at the girl carefully, his gaze focused. He was silent. He reached into his pocket, a tired expression on his face. The colonel said, "A difficult subject to interrogate." The man had a note in his hands. He studied it carefully, propping his head up with his hand. He said, "South." The girl sat at the table with a slightly guilty expression. Black said, "You're lost, in short." Sherry, with a satisfied smile, ate with appetite. The man said, "Well, you could just leave in the carriage." The man's face had a thoughtful expression, his eyes fixed on the girl. The man said calmly, "But alas, now I am without her." Sherry continued to look at him in surprise. The man exhaled tiredly. He decided to walk to think. His voice sounded calm and restrained. Sherry, holding a fork in her hand, raised her head. Black said, "I think if you walk all day, you'll come back." "Okay, I have the day off today," Colonel Black said sternly. The man stood up from the table and added, "You chose the wrong person to ask." His voice was firm. Sherry ran quickly towards the man and looked at him pitifully, blocking his path. The man towered over Sherry, his golden eyes cold and confident. The girl raised her head slightly, her gaze expressing surprise and slight confusion. "You don't know yet, but," the colonel said confidently, with a hint of indifference, standing in front of the little girl, "you were abandoned." The man continued, a mute, stumbling lump. The girl was confused. He said, "It's strange that you didn't leave earlier, because your mother is capable of such things." Sherry grabbed the colonel's coat again, leaving the fabric crumpled. He turned his head to the side irritably and cast an angry glance at the girl. She looked at him. "It would be better to send you to a shelter, although there probably isn't any room there now," Black said heartlessly. He turned and quickly walked out of the room, leaving little Sherry alone. The girl took a piece of paper and a pen out of her pocket and began to write something on it with concentration. The street was illuminated by the bright sun. Tall buildings rose up, reflecting the light in their windows. The green-eyed girl ran up to Colonel Black from the front and handed him a piece of paper. He thought, persistent. My mother is not a bad person. She will not leave me. If you bring me home, she will reward you. It was there, the colonel thought, looking at the piece of paper. It's not funny anymore, although it's hard for children to understand. The young man unfolded the piece of paper on which Sherry had written and saw dried blood there. He lowered the piece of paper and thought, his eyes wide open, looking at the girl. He touched her shoulder and came a little closer. She looked up at him. The colonel began to show the little girl the back of the sheet of paper with blood. "Where did you get this?" The tall man quickly began to remove the black glove from one hand in front of Sherry. Sitting down at the same level as the girl, he extended his bare palm to her, urging her to write the answer there. The green-eyed girl took a pen and, holding the man's fingers with one hand, began to write on the palm. Colonel Black became noticeably nervous and waited anxiously for the youngest to finish writing. The girl, having finished writing the answer on her palm, moved away from the man a little, pen in hand. She was tense. "Take me home and find out." Colonel Black read, looking first at the girl and then at the palm. The young man raised his head and glanced at little Sherry, sighing tiredly. The blonde stood with confidence and unwaveringly. She demanded to be taken home. The colonel laughed briefly and looked at Sherry. She was still standing tensely. Did I really sit down? Evelyn thought, sitting down on the bench with a basket of flowers and old age. I feel like I imagined all this. What nonsense! She continued to think. The girl turned her head slightly to the side, noticing a crowd of young people who were discussing something. The country has changed so much since the Winter family's head was replaced. Because she's a witch, someone from the people said. If only we could get rid of all these nobles. They said. Evelyn thought. I shouldn't be here. I'd better get out of here. The girl continued her train of thought, getting up from the bench and leaving the place. The stranger with the firearm stood behind the green-eyed woman. She did not notice it. Somewhere between the well-lit alleys, someone's old and velvety voice was heard. Mrs. Sonia! His Majesty ordered you to return. So stubborn, she said. I'm going deaf now. I understood. I'll return. I want to get some fresh air, too, the girl said, after which one figure caught her attention. There was a tall man with black hair and a strong build standing on the street. He was talking to someone. Colonel Black! The pink-haired girl screamed. The maid exclaimed, Oh my God, she's going to finish me off. The girl asked, What are you doing here? The colonel turned around at her words. He replied, I want to ask the same thing, Lady Perez. The girl said, Please just call me Sonia. What a coincidence that we meet here. Would you like a cup of tea? Sonia looked at Sherry. I'm a little busy right now, the black-haired man answered, holding the girl by her white cap. Lady Sonia looked at little Sherry in surprise and did not understand anything at all. It can't be. The colonel. The pink-haired girl started to speak, but the man interrupted her. No way. Yes? Then whose child is this? The girl thought. They don't look alike, thank God. And she said hello. Hello, baby. What's your name? How old are you, cutie? Lady Sonia asked. Sherry hid behind Black's coat. Black answered for her. She doesn't talk. The pink-haired girl began to apologize. God forgive me. Then what's her name? She asked. I just call her baby, Black said. Sherry was not pleased. Sonia laughed. Are you looking after someone's child? The colonel replied. You could say that. Have you had lunch yet? A new nice restaurant has recently opened. Why don't we have lunch there together? No, we'll be there soon. Black started to speak, but Sonia interrupted him. The baby seems hungry. The colonel turned around and looked with irritation at the little girl who wanted to eat. There were various and colorful dishes on the table that looked incredibly delicious. How appetizing! The girl looked ahead with bewilderment. Don't hurry or you'll feel sick. Eat little by little. She sat at the table, looking away. The man opposite her crossed his arms and looked at her. They were silent. The man turned to the girl at the table. What's wrong? Don't you like the soup? The pink-haired girl watched quietly. He got up from the table. He said, You eat, and I'll go have a smoke. The rest looked at him. Sonia, sitting at the table, turned to Sherry. Baby, are you well acquainted with the colonel? Maybe you know what kind of food he likes, or what he usually does? Sorry, you can't answer that. And it's generally not nice to discuss a person's personal life. But he's nice, since he looks after you, right? Sherry got angry and made a face at Lady Sonia, showing disapproval. She asked, No? She sat at the table, her head down thoughtfully. She said, Right? There are just so many rumors out there. Her gaze remained intense, her face flushed. But I decided that I would trust only my eyes. Sonia sat at the table with a smile, folding her hands. She said, Of course, Uncle treats me well too. The colonel also scared me at the first meeting. The girl looked at her with slight fear. They sat across the wooden table from each other. Sonia said, It was interesting to see you together. Meanwhile, the man, standing on the street with a cigarette in his teeth, was lost in thought. He leaned against the wall, looking thoughtfully into the distance, and thought, Funny, what am I doing? Slowly releasing a cloud of smoke, he was still very mysterious and thoughtful. He remembered the image of Sherry standing in front of him then, and thought, What should I do? The colonel recalled the revealing image of Evelyn in equestrian gear. She was a beautiful girl, The man held a cigarette in his mouth, his face illuminated by the soft rays of the sun. As he finished his cigarette, another thought flashed through his head. Disgusting people! Suddenly, a shot rang out in the middle of the street. Everyone around started screaming. Someone fired a shot. What's going on? There was panic in the street. People were moving away. The man said, "You better move away, it's not safe." The man looked around for the girl. His gaze became worried. Where is the baby? Where did she go? The girl looked around, searching. She noticed. We were holding hands. Where could she have disappeared to? Sherry fell to the floor and covered her face with her hands, her small shoulders shaking with fear and confusion. The maid ran up to Sonia. "Mistress, go away, it's dangerous here." "Wait, it's safe with the colonel." Black, with a stern expression on his face, silently looked through the anxious crowd, rushing in different directions. Sonia turned to the man in the long coat. He said, "Come back. Sorry, I can't accompany you." Sherry was still lying on the floor in fear, covering her face with her hands. Colonel Black approached her. The man stopped next to Sherry. He asked, "Sherry Winter, can you walk?" Sherry continued to bow before the man. He insisted, "Raise your head." The man helped Sherry up, his movements careful, but his expression stern. Colonel Black picked Sherry up and threw her over his shoulder, then said, "Annoying!" The sunset illuminates the ancient buildings, creating a warm and cozy atmosphere on the city street. The man turned around, thinking, "I've come as we agreed. Is the lady not here yet?" And then the man looked at the pockets of his blue coat, but he found nothing there. He stood frozen in fear, watching what was happening. It seemed as if everything around him had lost its colors in an instant. The blonde immediately thought, could this be the pickpocket I heard about? But he was interrupted by a certain man. A man in a red vest hugs a friend in a top hat and greets him cheerfully on the street. The blue-haired boy smiles warmly and asks, "What is His Highness doing here?" The building's architecture with tall glass structures is covered in sun rays. Max only laughed loudly in response, saying to the prince, "So you're penniless now?" Max kept saying, "You're too frivolous. As soon as you went out alone, you got lost." He laughed. He said, "I am generous today and will take you back." The prince refused, saying, "I have an appointment here." The blue-haired man looked confused. He was just wiping away the tears that remained after laughing. The blonde turned away from his friend in confusion. He began to tremble slightly, clenching his jaw tighter. And this behavior only attracted Max's attention, who smiled slyly and narrowed his eyes in response. The man came up from behind and asked with interest, "Date? Tell me, who is she? Is she beautiful?" The prince said, "Lend me some money and be on your way." Max said, "How can I leave the prince in danger?" He put his arm around the prince's shoulder and said, "We live together, but we don't know about this. You'll tell me, right?" But then the prince threw his hands off himself and also screamed very loudly. It was all wrong. The man even stuttered. In response to this, the man grinned slightly and narrowed his light eyes, sighing heavily. The prince tried to hide his embarrassment, but he failed. Max said, "Your face says otherwise." The guy asked again, confused. "Really?" Max said disappointedly. "This innocent bachelor fell in love," Max said. "Poor thing, it's time for a love lecture," the prince replied. "No advice needed from a libertine." And then Max continued to repeat, "One does not interfere with the other. Since ancient times, women, prince." But the man with blue hair didn't have time to finish. A shot rang out, causing them to flinch. Max turned around in surprise, holding the prince by the shoulder. A shot? They were looking in the same direction. "Sherry is my precious treasure. I am ready to carry her in my arms all my life." The lady thought, imagining this. The girl, smiling warmly, would like to tell her, "You have nothing to worry about. I will always protect you." And then the little girl would relax, leaning closer to her mother's chest and closing her eyes. But it was all a dream of Sherry, who was carried in Gillas's arms, and he immediately asked, "Are you awake?" She was surprised. The sunlight illuminated Gillas's face, shone into his eyes. The girl watched, as if enchanted, but it didn't last long, because the man immediately put her down on the floor, saying, "Then go yourself now." Gillas pulled ahead and also said to little Sherry, whose back was hurting, "Don't fall behind." And then the man met a certain person and started chatting with him. The girl immediately went somewhere, but the brunette noticed it right away, and also narrowed his yellow eyes, pressing his lips together. He followed Sherry. The girl was capricious and pulled the hem of his coat behind her. She tried and applied all her strength. The man just looked at the little girl in confusion. His yellow eyes widened, frowning. But then the man stopped and extended his black-gloved hand toward the girl, saying, "Sherry, give me your hand." The man added, only after a few moments, "Isn't it awkward for both of us when you're in our arms?" And then the girl extended her hand to the man. She was surprised by such a gesture, and therefore opened her eyes wide. The girl grabbed the man's thumb because she couldn't even reach his palm. The girl tried hard to keep up with the man's quick steps, who didn't even look back at her. But the girl couldn't take her eyes off him. She kept her green eyes wide open. The man, in her eyes, looked impressive and strong. She studied him carefully. The man's gaze was stern and cold, as always. Only this time, he still had traces of fatigue. Watching him and his movements, the girl grabbed his hand even tighter, afraid to let go. But suddenly, a certain person screamed very loudly, "Sherry!" The man and the girl froze in surprise. The two men were almost in tears as they said, "Where have you gone?" "Gone in the blink of an eye. I'm a dead man." One man was almost crying, clutching his head. He said, "If I don't find you, Evelyn will gut me." The man noticed Sherry and immediately turned to her. His voice finally calmed down, but the girl was surprised. Looking at this picture, the man immediately lowered the hand of the little girl, who looked at him in confusion. Then Hylas nodded to the little girl, his gaze once again distant and indifferent. She watched him. The surprise of the little girl was visible, her green eyes wide open. And then, just a moment later, the girl actually ran away from the man. He was standing. His gaze relaxed for a moment, and it even seemed as if Giles was sad. The man couldn't move from his spot, watching the silhouette of the little girl receding ahead. The little girl continued to run away from the man, who looked after her in confusion. But then, just a few moments later, the little girl turned and ran towards him. The little one held out her fist to him, clutching something tightly. She pressed her lips together, and her gaze was determined. And then, just a few moments later, the girl decided to unclench her fist, which contained the candy. The man asked again in surprise, without leaning towards the gift. The girl felt awkward. But then, just a few moments later, the boy leaned closer to the candy, as if about to take it. But in reality, he only squeezed the girl's hand tighter and didn't even touch the child's gift. The man said, addressing her, "Sherry Winter." The girl froze in surprise, her eyes wide open. The man immediately asked her, "How old are you?" His gaze became more stern and serious. The girl pointed with her fingers in fear. She was 9 years old, but she didn't understand why Giles was asking this. And then the man frowned. He narrowed his yellow eyes slightly as he looked at the little girl in front of him. And then the man got up from the floor, saying in a calm voice, "That's it, run already." Sherry froze. But after a few moments, the girl ran to the other men, and Gillas decided to smoke. The man thought, shifting his gaze. 9 years. The expulsion from the duchy happened about 10 years ago. The man remembered that night when the girl hugged him and kissed him. He couldn't get it out of his head. But then the man clenched his black-gloved fist tighter, as if driving away these bad thoughts. The man frowned again, his hair falling over his face as he thought, "What kind of useless thoughts are these?" And then the man noticed a whole crowd of people ahead, shouting, "You can't come here!" A shot was heard. The prince tried to push his way through the crowd of people, shouting, "Let me through!" Max tried to stop him. Giles watched this indifferently, thinking, "Why is he here?" The prince screamed. "Let me go already!" The man screamed, "Lady!" And only then did Giles notice something that made his eyes widen. In front of him, on the asphalt, lay pieces of a white scarf, a wooden cane, and traces of blood. And then the man looked away and looked further. There was a red hat, a basket of apples, shards. And only then did the man remove the cigarette from his mouth, his yellow eyes wide open as he watched this. It was already getting dark. The setting sun's rays were already illuminating many buildings and windows. A man was walking behind a certain girl who was carrying a basket and wearing a red hat. Noticing her, he quickened his pace even more and almost ran after the stranger. The girl didn't suspect anything. It was Evelyn, in whose basket lay white roses. But suddenly, right next to her head, the barrel of a revolver appeared. The girl froze in place, realizing the situation. The man in the black robe said, "Evelyn Winter." The girl just narrowed her eyes, as if she was bored. But then the girl managed to quickly back away from the attacker, and also took out her pistol, turning around. The girl, without wasting a minute, immediately shot the man. Her gaze was stern and determined, but she was unable to give a quality fight back, because the man squeezed her throat, pressing her against the wall. The man towered over her, and then, as if through clenched teeth, he growled. He had finally found her. He pointed the gun at her. He began to strangle the girl, not allowing her to move. Evelyn looked at the man in front of her in bewilderment. But then, with trembling hands, the girl tried to throw his hands off her neck. Her gaze changed. But now all that remained before Giles's eyes were Evelyn's cane and traces of blood. It was clear who had left them. A voice from the crowd kept saying. The shot rang out twice. The armed man disappeared, along with the woman. The voice continued to repeat everything that people already knew. Giles touched the bloodstains on the asphalt. She immediately painted the glove, and the man studied it carefully, squinting his eyes. But suddenly, a certain man addressed the brunette. "Move over!" he shouted. Giles turned around displeased. People were shouting, "Look, it's the prince!" Unbelievable! The blonde was heading towards the colonel, who stood up. The blonde kept telling the man, "This is our first meeting since the royal castle." "Colonel?" Giles replied sarcastically. "His Highness the Prince? I'm honored that you remember me." And then the blonde clenched his fists. It was obvious that he felt awkward as he spoke. It would be strange not to remember. The brunette asked boredly, "What? Have you come to have fun? I wouldn't want to disturb you." But he was suddenly interrupted. Max said quickly, "Hello, Colonel. I'm Max Klebe, about to enlist in the military." But the brunette interrupted him. "You don't have to continue. The area behind the royal castle is not suitable for games." The blonde's hands were shaking. He clutched even tighter a certain red cloth that clearly belonged to the girl. The prince asked excitedly, as the man was about to leave them, "Won't you help me find the lady?" The prince kept saying, "I know you're good at tracking. It shouldn't be too hard for you, right?" The prince handed the cloth to the brunette, who narrowed his eyes. The blonde said, "This belongs to the lady." The blonde exhaled heavily and then asked again, "Please help me find her. This happened because of me." But in response, the man only looked at the blonde man in front of him in bewilderment. He held a cigarette in his mouth. Then the colonel said, "I'm sorry, but I don't have to obey His Highness." The blonde was surprised. The guy's gaze became more angry and stern. And then, after a few moments of silence, he said, "I understand." And then the man closed his eyes in response and shook his head. He was going to say goodbye to them, but the blonde shouted, stopping him, "If you find Lady Winter, I will fulfill any of your wishes." Then the prince shouted, "If there is trouble, I will take responsibility." And only then did the brunette turn around with interest. The people behind were watching the prince attentively, and then the man said, "I think you're wrong. It's not your fault." He didn't even want to look at the red cloth. The man kept saying, looking at the sunset in the distance, "The lady has enough enemies. Don't feel guilty about it." But then the man still took the red cloth from the prince's hands, speaking, and even without desire. The man grabbed the only clue tightly and said indifferently, "I will definitely find it." A military man stood in front of him, repeating, "Colonel, come back as soon as possible." The brunette walked past, but then the brunette said it anyway. "Yes, a sour end to the holiday." He bowed his head slightly. The colonel said, "Send a search party." His subordinate replied, "Good. Anything else needed?" And then the man looked away with his yellow eyes into the distance, as if he was thinking about something. This matter was important to him. And then the colonel clutched the red cloth, the only thing left of the young girl, even tighter. The man began to examine the area and said, "Hurry!" The subordinate replied, "Understood." The men walked down the narrow street, their footsteps sounding hollow. One of them turned to look around. A young man stood in an elegant suit. His face was thoughtful. He looked ahead. Meanwhile, somewhere in the snowy mountains, in the center of the forest stood a house, covered in snow. Smoke rose from the chimney, disappearing into the sky. And in this house, on the floor, lay Evelyn in a red dress. Her breathing slowed, she moved barely noticeably, the rustling of her clothes breaking the silence. She opened her eyes, her gaze full of confusion. The room was quiet. A voice was heard. "Are you awake?" The man drank from his flask, frowning. He said, "Shoot from such a distance." He rubbed his temples with his hand, his tired gaze giving way to thought. He said, "It wasn't easy." Evelyn, lying on the floor, turned her head. She said, "After all, it was you." "Joseph." He raised his voice in irritation, clenching his fists. He said, "It's an honor that you remember my face. That day you threw me out like a dog, remembering the hardships you had to endure." The guy hit Evelyn hard in the stomach. "I feel anger flaring up inside." The man watched the girl lying on the floor. "I don't know if you remember. I told you I'd kill you. The Red Hawk Brotherhood has a bounty on your head." Distracted Isaac. "You're the one who kidnapped Sherry." The boy shouted, "If I hadn't let her go, I would have torn her apart before your eyes." The captive sat huddled on the floor with her hands tied. Still full of energy, the man waved his hand and watched the woman bowing before him. He said, "Come on, damn woman." With her hands tied, Evelyn stood before the grinning boy. He said, "Try to fight." Finally falling onto the floor in front of him, Evelyn breathed heavily. The boy looked confused and shocked. He said quietly, "What are you?" The girl with golden hair, weakened, asked for help. She whispered, "Save me, Joseph." Exhausted, she could barely stand on her feet, desperately whispering, "If you help me." The man looked back in surprise, his gaze expressing suspicion and alarm. The girl looked up with despair in her eyes, saying, "I'll do anything." But the guy squeezed the girl's hair hard and shouted, "Anything! Do you even understand what you're talking about?" Evelyn smiled relaxedly and replied, "I know what I'm talking about." The boy looked at the Duchess with a red face and said, "It only seems to be our friction with Joseph." But the girl, looking at her interlocutor, said, "You want me, don't you? Let me go. I'll do whatever you want." Hearing this, he chuckled. "And this is what you call nobility, a typical woman of easy virtue." While Evelyn was kneeling in front of him, the man said, "I can't let you go." And stretching his fly, he grinned and added smugly, "First, I'll check how useful you can be." Meanwhile, the search dog touched the fabric with its nose and sniffed the scent. A soldier stood with a dog on a snowy field. The wind was getting stronger. Snow fell on their shoulders. The snow was getting heavier. The surroundings were filled with tension. The man said, "Will everything be okay if we continue?" The commander answered his subordinate with a cold look. "Let's continue. If the weather gets worse, we'll end the search." The dog gave a signal, barking loudly. Something in the snow caught its attention. The people became wary. A man in military uniform with a cold gaze stood against the backdrop of snow-capped mountains. Meanwhile, in the house, the guy grabbed the girl by the head with force, bringing her closer to him. The kidnapper had already unbuckled his belt and muttered, "You have to keep your word, right? Do it right." Evelyn sat at the guy's feet, and he drank from the bottle, anticipating how the Duchess would please him. The guy raised the flask to his lips and drank slowly and said, "Here comes the day." But Evelyn wasn't going to please this scoundrel. She was thinking about how to escape. Suddenly, her feet, bare to the ankles, slid across the floor, and she jerked towards the man. Suddenly, the girl waited for an unexpected moment and pushed her offender straight into the fire that was behind his back. The fire flared up behind the dark-haired man. He raised his hand with the bottle and looked ahead in confusion. The wooden house burst into flames. A blonde woman ran out into the snow, and a scream was heard from inside. Evelyn stood in the cold, turning to face the burning building. The boy continued to scream in pain. "Damn, woman!" And then the house went up in flames. Evelyn's eyes widened, shocked by the unexpected explosion. Engulfed in flames and screaming in pain, the boy shouted, "You're a bastard! I'll finish you off!" A view of a house in the middle of a snowy forest, engulfed in flames. There, the girl thought, I can't die. Evelyn walked forward resolutely through the snow, thinking, I can't die. Not like this. Not like this. The girl's bare feet left marks in the snow, she thought. dangerous situations. Evelyn looked straight ahead. She was determined. I have survived countless times. With a layer of snow on her hair and cheeks, the girl suddenly heard the address. Lady! The blonde in the burgundy dress stood facing the figure in the distance, her breath caught in the frosty air. The tall stranger in the gray cloak extended his hand towards her, his gaze focused. The girl with green eyes looked ahead in surprise, her face frozen. She whispered, Rowan! However, suddenly she felt someone grab her tied hands. The fugitive looked back in despair, her breathing quickening. Frightened, Evelyn jumped away from the guy and screamed loudly. The soldier looked at the girl with a thoughtful and surprised look. He was silent. Evelyn, looking anxiously at the approaching man, said, Ah, Rowan! Lady, stop! The guy continued, but she didn't listen. You must cooperate with the military search party. If you don't comply. A light wind ruffled the fugitive's fair hair. She stopped when she heard a voice. The man in uniform watched her actions, his face remaining serious. He took a step forward, calling out to her. Please wait, lady! The officer's steps and boots were visible in the snow. He said, It's all right. I won't hurt you. Evelyn walked through the snow, leaving footprints with her bare feet. She heard, Danger ahead. Wait. The officer in uniform stood with a stern expression and shouted, Lady! The officer with the golden eyes was frozen in attention as he watched what was happening around him. Evelyn's bare feet left marks in the snow as she walked through the drifts despite the cold. The man's face looked focused, determination evident in the snowstorm. The man with white hair and a dark cloak looked stern. He said, Come here, faster. The guy extended his hand to the desperate girl. She couldn't realize that it was just a projection of her consciousness. She looked forward hopefully. Said, Rowan, please wait a little longer. The man with white hair held out his hand. A drop of blood was running down his cheek. However, suddenly a shot was heard in space. It hit Evelyn right in the shoulder, causing her to stagger. Drops of blood flew around as the green-eyed girl looked at the wound in horror. The girl fell off the cliff, and the man stayed in place. She thought, Right. The officer with golden eyes looked into the distance. The wind swept past, creating the illusion of movement. Evelyn was surrounded by symbols and flowers. She thought doomedly, You came for me, Rowan. The colonel moved through the snow with a weapon in his hands. The girl thought, Too bad, Colonel. Revenge was in vain. Evelyn, exhausted, continued to fall, her face reflecting pain and bewilderment. She whispered, But why? Gillas screamed in rage, his eyes blazing with anger. She kept thinking, You! His hand reached out into the void, trying to grab hold of someone else's body. The air was filled with tension. Gillas rushed forward to grab Evelyn, who was falling into the abyss, her dress fluttering in the wind. A black hat with gold embroidery fell onto a snowy slope. An icy wind swirled around. Snowy mountains surrounded the frozen valley. An icy stream made its way between the rocks. A frozen river ran through an icy canyon, with a frosty fog hanging over it. A man in military uniform carried Evelyn in his arms as he emerged from the icy river. The wind grew stronger. The man looked down, his face tense. He exhaled. The boy continued to forcefully press the wounded girl closer to him. His gun was clamped between him and her. The man carried the girl in his arms, looking up. He said, Lady! The girl, bleeding, was held tightly by someone else's hands. Her dress was covered in bloodstains. Noticing someone else's open bullet wound, Gillas's eyes widened in fear and horror. Continuing to walk along the icy river in search of shelter, he suddenly froze. His gaze was directed somewhere to the side. Beads of sweat were running down his face from the tension. At the end, the guy noticed a well-furnished, trodden passage to the cave. A small saucepan hung over a fire lit with sticks. Covered with someone else's warm Chanel and bandaged, Evelyn moaned painfully in her delirium. Finally, with difficulty opening her emerald eyes, the girl looked around. Looking at the guy standing over the fire and the pot, she called out, Colonel! Hearing a tired, quiet voice behind him, Gillas turned around. He said calmly, I managed to bandage the wound. Fortunately, you were only grazed. The guy sat down next to the growing fire and asked, The one who shot. You know him. Pressing her hand to the bandaged wound, Evelyn looked down at the floor and fell silent. She remembered. Jonah Palmon. He held a grudge after being banished from the duchy. The guy twirled the vessel in his hand. You've crossed many people's paths. At this rate, he'll die quickly. Evelyn turned an unreadable gaze in his direction. It's hard with greedy servants. What's more important? She asked reasonably. Why did you save me? Weren't you the one who wanted me dead? The guy put the bowler hat on the floor and turned towards her. His gaze seemed impenetrable. He replied coldly, I have to find and return the victim. The girl remarked sarcastically. How responsible. However, Gillas did not react to someone else's mockery and only approached the edge of the cave. He decided to ask a question that had long interested him. Leg. What happened? Hearing this, Evelyn seemed shocked. Her green eyes widened. However, quickly pulling herself together, the girls calmly replied, I got caught in a trap while hunting. The guy didn't seem to believe her words at all and asked. And that's all, she answered. This is a pointless question. Are you going to feel sorry for me? However, Gillas, without even turning around, answered coldly and indifferently. No way, he continued. I think that eased my load. The evening mountains were covered with a snowstorm. The weather continued to deteriorate mercilessly. Covered by a heavy man's overcoat, Evelyn began to breathe heavily. The fire continued to illuminate the cave. Suddenly, feeling a sharp, piercing pain, the girl grabbed her hand and grimaced. The sharp pain subsided a little, and bending over, she continued to breathe heavily and raggedly. The guy asked, Do you have pain in your chest? He guessed. Perhaps the rib is broken. Hearing this, the girl looked up and said venomously, You're playing the doctor. The guy didn't answer and, pulling the black glove tighter onto his hand, came closer to her. Gently, but firmly enough, he grabbed the girl by the shoulder, causing her to freeze in surprise. Laying Evelyn down on the cold, hard floor of the cave, he calmly ordered, Don't move. However, raising her hands in protest, the girl demanded with displeasure, Hey, don't touch! But the guy didn't listen to her discontent. Pressing the stranger's hands to the ground, he continued. Clamped in a strong male grip, Evelyn couldn't move, and only looked at the guy in surprise. His gaze remained cold, unreadable. Looking down at the girl, he said, Here's another one. Evelyn's lips tightened in anger. Her eyes narrowed, and her gaze seemed hunted. She bared her teeth and pulled her legs closer to her. Gillas continued. However, someone else's attempt to kick the guy in the face was unsuccessful, as he calmly blocked it with his palm. Having pressed the girl to the ground, not only by her arms, but also by her legs, he again continued the examination. He also used his foot to press down on the other's legs so that Evelyn could not kick. Tired of other people's attempts to escape, the guy calmly told the angry girl, It's useless! Continue and the broken rib can puncture the lung, causing bleeding, coughing up blood and death. His gaze became tense and his voice became icy. If you don't want to die so miserably, a stranger's hand touched the wounded part of the girl's body. Then cooperate. Feeling this, the girl clenched her teeth. Her eyes widened in indignation, and she hissed, You? Right. The guy kept pressing on different places, trying to find the right one. Here. He lifted the stranger's sweater higher and pressed harder on the right place. It hurt. Feeling this, Evelyn's eyes widened even more. A drop of sweat ran down her cheek. The hands, clasped by someone else's strong male palm, clenched. Sweat ran down them too. The other hand came up a little higher, continuing to search for the wounded and aching fracture site. He asked patiently, Please answer. His gaze rose higher to the girl. However, she continued to remain silent, illuminated by the warmth of the growing fire. Gillas raised his hand and, using his teeth, pulled the leather glove off his palm, throwing it aside. Now, continuing to run his bare palm over the naked female torso, he waited for Evelyn to speak. Feeling the warmth of someone else's hands on her bare stomach, the girl watched his actions with alarm. The guy pressed harder in a certain place. Suddenly, the girl finally screamed loudly, Enough! A drop of sweat ran down her cheek. Hearing this, Gillas looked at Evelyn coldly, his amber eyes seeming completely impenetrable. The girl's legs began to tremble. Pulling them under herself, the girl continued pitifully. She turned away exhausted and finally said, exhaling, Stop it! The man grabbed the girl's two hands, which were trembling slightly. Evelyn tried to justify herself. The girl was lying on the floor and also looked away from the man with embarrassment. She kept telling him, "Enough." The man's gaze became clouded. His black hair softly outlined his face, his cheeks flushed with embarrassment. But then, just a moment later, the man had already lowered his yellow eyes, thinking about something. The man sat closer to the embarrassed girl and then said, "I don't think it's broken." Evelyn felt awkward. Evelyn sighed heavily at his words, and her green eyes widened. She blushed even more. The man again tried to touch the girl's two hands, which were above her head. But then the girl suddenly stood up, not giving Giles a chance to touch her. He looked at her. The man said, "We'll have to bandage it." He looked at the bandage, which was already soaked with blood. Giles tried to touch the girl's hand again to help, but she pushed his palm away from her. The girl narrowed her eyes slightly, and then said to the man with displeasure, "Don't touch my body." The man exhaled heavily in response and turned away from the girl. He rolled his eyes at Evelyn's behavior, and then Giles threw bandages towards the girl, saying, "In that case, bandage it yourself." Evelyn was surprised, and then the man walked away from the girl. Evelyn looked after Giles in confusion, squeezing his hand. After a few moments of silence, the girl with green eyes decided to ask the man, "Where are you going?" The man, without even turning around, said, "For firewood. Rest assured, I'm not going to run away." But the girl's gaze did not change from these words. Evelyn only frowned, as if puzzled. Meanwhile, near the castle, which was far away from them, there was a snowstorm that covered the statues. The castle itself was quite warm and cozy. It had an expensive interior and various luxuries. Only the people in it seemed to be in despair. The prince was sitting on a chair, and Max and a crowd of people were standing next to him. Max was closest to the prince, who leaned forward as if thinking. The crowd of aristocrats moved away from them. But then, Max suddenly said, he didn't know that the prince's companion was Lady Winter. He finally opened his eyes. Max said discontentedly, "I hope there won't be any problems, and there's no need to worry." The prince looked at him. The prince's blue eyes changed at that moment, becoming more severe and serious. He raised his head higher. The blue-haired man clenched his jaw, then spat out the words, "She's a widow!" Max turned away, but the prince only asked the man indifferently, "So what?" There was no trace left of the indecisive boy. Max screamed, hoping for the blonde's good sense, "Are you crazy? She's the witch who destroyed Rowan!" The scream was too loud, and so the maids who were behind watched the two of them in fear. The blue-eyed man calmly repeated, "The widow of a genius. Are you saying she deserves to be kidnapped?" The man tried to justify himself. "I didn't mean that." But the prince interrupted him, saying, "Regardless of status," the blonde insisted, "I am obliged to provide protection to all citizens of Alteryk, so watch your words." The blue-haired boy didn't dare to object anymore, and so he just let out a tired sigh, swaying on two legs. Max, after a minute of silence, finally said thoughtfully, "I hope so." The blonde lowered his head. The prince remembered the face of Gillas, who kept saying, "I am not obliged to obey His Highness, but I will find her. I'll definitely find her." The blonde remembered his words again and again, but his hands began to shake. The man looked down again, trying to hide his concern for the lady. The prince pressed his lips tightly together. Meanwhile, beyond the walls of the warm castle, winter was already reigning. There was a snowstorm, and frost lay on the trees. Only in a few places, through the snowdrifts, could one still see small pieces of grass. Gillas finally returned to the girl and brought firewood. Evelyn was breathing heavily, her eyes closed. Noticing the girl's strange state, the man immediately turned his gaze to her, studying Evelyn's behavior. There was still blood on the bandage, so it was clear at first glance that Evelyn had not bandaged it. But the man decided not to notice, and so he simply put the firewood on the ground and began rummaging through his pockets. He then moved closer to the girl and grabbed her cheek, forcing her to turn around. But the man gave her a candy. The girl opened her mouth, unable to resist Gillas. She frowned. Evelyn asked, confused, "Chocolate. Where did you get it?" Gillas replied, "Your daughter gave it to me." Evelyn immediately screamed in fear, her eyes wide. "You saw Sherry? You didn't do anything to her, did you?" But the man remained silent, as if he did not even want to answer the girl's questions. He threw wood on the fire, and then the man finally spoke. She said she was 9 years old. The girl's eyes widened in response, but after a moment, she erased that expression. Evelyn frowned, asking with displeasure. So what? The man asked in response, looking at the fire. Isn't she too small for her age? The man kept saying this without even turning to look at Evelyn, who was watching him. I thought she was younger. The girl squeezed her hand with the wound, which still hurt, as if she didn't even want to answer his questions. The girl asked Gillas with displeasure. What nonsense! She frowned. It was obvious that she felt worse. Gillas turned around and then decided to ask. Haven't they changed the bandage yet? The wound might get infected if left. The girl looked down, as if she didn't want to look at the man. She said, I'll figure it out without you. The man sat down, saying, Yes, please. And I'll rest for now. They were a couple of meters apart. The girl turned her displeased gaze to the man, who also decided to turn away from Evelyn. Meanwhile, the winter weather was raging. There was a thick layer of snow on the mountains, and the blizzard was blowing away everything around. Hylas was lying on the ground, but suddenly opened his yellow eyes. He was awakened by the heavy sighs of the girl next to him. The man reached for his gun because he probably didn't realize that the sounds were coming from an innocent girl. Evelyn was in agony, shaking and trying to change the bandage with one hand. Her whole hand was covered in blood. Only then did Gillas finally decide to turn around to look at the girl's efforts behind him. She still didn't give up and tried to do all the work on her own. It was obvious that she was having a hard time. But then, just a moment later, the girl easily threw the bloody clothes onto the floor. She did this so that her movements would no longer be restricted. Her long hair covered her back, but they were in the girl's way, and so she barely touched the golden curls, which were perfect even now. The man watched her indifferently, as if it meant nothing to him at all. It was only then, when the girl brushed her hair away from her back, that he noticed her back, which was covered in scars. Hylas did not expect this, and so his yellow eyes widened in surprise. He could not utter a word. He couldn't stop looking at the blonde's back, which was covered in deep scars.